cry, even better if you beg. Chapter 46. The moment our eyes met, the chatty and loud children who had been laughing until their ears hurt became surprisingly calm at the moment they entered the annex. Their eyes twinkled with delight as they looked around the house but couldn't dare to make jokes and fool around like before. Leyla had to appease the frightened Monica first, so she was the last to enter the annex, and the servants welcomed the Duke's young guest with the same servility they gave to the VIP guests. "This way, please." One of the servants promptly escorted the waiting children from the guest lounge to the living room. Inside, Matthias was sitting there with his back against the window overlooking the river. He had been waiting for them to arrive. Leyla held her breath as she walked into the place riddled with horrible, embarrassing, and humiliating memories. "Thank you so much for your kindness in allowing us to visit Arvis, Duke." Mrs. Grever was effusive in her thanks, and her vivacity put Leyla at ease. She hoped her teacher friend would take the role as the Duke's converser, so she could sit quietly like the room's furniture and leave the place when the pleasantries were over. "Rather, I should be thankful to all of you for accepting my sudden invitation." Matthias welcomed them as he rose from his seat. The window's backlight cast a shadow over his face, but it amplified the sense of his presence. "Teacher. It hurts." Monica's whispers startled Leyla, who was staring blankly at his silhouette. "My hand hurts." Monica moaned in pain. Layla's eyes widened as she realized she was gripping the child's hand too tightly. Sorry. I'm so sorry, Monica." She massaged Monica's wrist in a panic, and at the time, the door flew open to the balcony facing the riverside. The scent of fresh water was wafting from the open door. Leyla swiveled to face the view. A sumptuous tea table which was set up in the sun-drenched terrace and the white tablecloth that gently swayed along with the wind captured her eyes in a blink. "Let's go." Matthias' gaze flew from Leyla to Mrs. Grever. The teacher accepted his escort by lightly placing her hand on his arm with her blushing cheeks. The astonished children, who had never had a time of this kind, happily followed the Duke with a zealous expression on their face. Leyla walked with Monica in tow and was the last to head to the balcony. "Whoa, teacher. I feel like I'm becoming a princess." As she walked onto the balcony, Monica rolled her eyes, and her innocent face glowed with adoration. Leyla couldn't debate the child's praises, as the vibrantly colored assortment of bites that was served on the balcony's table looked quite appetizing. It was amazing to think about how promptly they had everything ready. She caught sight of the bouquet of baby breath flowers, and red asters gracing the table's centerpiece. There were teacups and exquisite silverware on the table, much too many for the rural schoolchildren. And the scenic beauty of Shelter River beyond the railing was the perfect setting for their afternoon meals. A beam of sunlight hit her slender glasses frame and shattered like shrapnel. Matthias's eyes wandered throughout those shards of light. The jewel blue flowing river, the daughter of the sky, bright white sun, and the sea of trees, beneath a garland of scarlets and golds. In the autumn moment of Arvis, where all the beautiful colors of nature were at their most vivid, their eyes met. Monica was delighted over the moon. She roistered endlessly at how pretty the annex was, of how handsome the Duke was, and the tasty cake she had eaten. That child couldn't stop herself from extolling everything. Whoa! This time, that child was hooked on by the scoop of ice cream. Her eyes sparkled at the ice cream dish, and she hurriedly reached out her hand to Leyla sitting beside her. Leyla gave a surprised look, and Monica whispered, "Teacher, it tastes like clouds." Leyla blinked a few times before catching on to what the child was trying to say. With a smile, she took a napkin and gently wiped Monica's lips to clean the ice cream smudge on her lips. Monica had just started school this year. She was physically smaller than her peers, a scaredy cat, and still a shy girl. Her introverted nature made it difficult for her to socialize with other children. She used to cry, wanting to go back home every day. And for the first few weeks, Leyla had an uphill struggle to cope with that child. But now, she was Layla's best disciple among her classmates. After learning that Monica's mother died from an illness last spring, Leyla had a deeper understanding of the child's heart. "Teacher, you should try it too." "No, Monica. Teacher is fine." Leyla scrupled for a moment. But she maturely refused. Albeit, there was no law prohibiting adults from eating ice cream, she didn't want to seem childish in front of the Duke by eating the ice cream that was prepared for the children only. Leyla took another sip of the half-cold tea as she eavesdropped on the ongoing table talk. Mrs. Grever was leading the conversation with a bubbly attitude, just as she wished. Meanwhile, ridding her mind of its load, Leyla threw a glance at Matthias, who sat at the head chair. He was listening attentively to Mrs. Grever. His brief replies and smile presented impeccable courtesy. Strangely enough, by displaying such a perfect turn, the other people could sense his dominance and classiness in the relationship. All of his gestures were haughty but graceful at the same time. Like a researcher, she observed Matthias intently when Monica suddenly stood up and approached her with a bowl of ice cream. Teacher, this ice cream is so delicious. Please try it." When her tiny hand was tugging her sleeve, Leyla flinched and pulled back. Monica dropped the ice cream bowl and it splattered all over her skirt. The loud fuss drew the attention of everyone seated at the table to her. "I'm sorry, teacher." Monica blanched when the bowl fell to the hardwood floor, covering her teacher's skirt with ice cream. Tears slowly crept out of her eyes. "Don't cry. Teacher is fine." Leyla smiled and quickly wiped the ice cream with the napkin to soothe the child. Meanwhile, the maids reached them quickly and rushed to wipe the wet floor. Leyla was flustered after taking a look at her sticky hands and stained skirt. Seeing that, Matthias gestured at the maid standing close to her and she hurriedly ushered Leyla into the powder room. Monica was about to burst into tears when Leyla left the terrace, but luckily Bill Remmer calmed her down. At the same time, Mark Evers discreetly approached. "Duke, Count Klein wants to have a call with you. Come and read on our website Wuxia World site." "Thanks." The more she rubbed it, the larger and more stubborn the ice cream stain became on her skirt. Leyla gave up and just washed her hands and face. By luck, she was wearing a dark-colored kilt, which helped a lot in hiding the stain. She carefully turned off the sink's gold faucet and checked her reflection in the mirror. Her cheeks were blushing red from a fruitless effort to remove ice cream stains off her skirt. She tidied her droopy hair and took a breath before leaving the powder room. It wasn't long before she tensed up again, a heavy feeling in her stomach as she saw the Duke leaning against the hallway wall leading to the living room. Matthias looked at her, smiling when she gasped, "Damn!" A frown appeared on her face, and she looked around. There was no one else here, and her mind whirled, alarmed of what could happen next. "Don't tell me he's been waiting for me." After several minutes had passed, he remained standing there, nonchalantly staring at her. A sneer sneaked out the corner of his lips, a satirical grin that those who lauded him as a faultless aristocrat would never know. And every time he cracked a smile like that, Leyla knew something bad was going to happen to her. Ominous hunch overwhelmed her. She gulped, her shaking hands clenched, waiting for him to get out of the way. But Leyla decided not to waste time that would cause an unnecessary misunderstanding. Without letting go of her guard, she took a watchful stride forward. Matthias, still leaning against the wall, kept his eyes intact on her. And once she got closer, he blatantly stood in the middle of the corridor. Seeing her flinch in fear and step back from him, Matthias' chuckle grew louder. After a short phone call from Count Klein, without a particular reason, he went in the opposite direction instead of going back to the balcony. He simply had the urge to wait for her since she hadn't yet returned. Just in case something interesting happened to her. Exactly just like right now. Leyla approached him with a straight face, as if marching to a battlefield. She intended to avoid him, but the hallway was incapacious. As she walked right next to him, Matthias slightly stuck out his leg. Leyla reflexively backed off, dodged it. But her joy soon turned into shame when he just pretended to move to change his posture. She now looked like an idiot jumping rabbit in front of the upright and elegant Duke. Matthias snickered and took a spin around as if nothing had happened. Alone in the hall, Leyla stayed still until he entered the living room and was no longer in her sight. A liar. She would undoubtedly be labeled as such if she told everyone about Duke Herhardt's absurd personality. No. Leyla tossed aside the thought and walked into the living room. Upon reaching the balcony, she saw him acting normal, like a model gentleman. He had a warm conversation with Mrs. Grever, and a smile never left his face. "Oh, welcome back, Miss Lewellin." Mrs. Grever was pleased when she came back. "Let's go boating." "Boating?" "The Duke said he'd lend our kids his yacht. Isn't it wonderful to have a boat ride in that beautiful river?" But Leyla shot her uncle a worried gaze, and Bill stepped forward. "My apologies, Duke, but Leyla is very afraid of water. It'll be hard for her to get on the boat." "Ah. I see." Matthias pretended to be saddened by the story, although he had seen her drowning in the same river a year ago. "Then Miss Lewellin, you can take a rest here." Why is he showing such consideration now? While his unexpected concern perplexed her, the children bolted off the balcony, accompanied by the Duke's servant. "Yes, Miss Lewellin. I'll go, so you can stay here." "Yes, don't worry, Leyla. I'll take care of those little ones." Bill smiled and took Monica's hand from Layla's. That child was scared and wanted to weep every time she saw Bill, but she was willing to follow him out of the blue. "Thank you, Mr. Grever and Uncle Bill too." Leyla felt embarrassed but thanked them for their kindness. They were nice people, unlike the enigmatic Duke. Apart from that, she also felt lucky to be able to stay away from the Duke. However, as she waited, Matthias didn't get up from his chair. She gave him a confused look. Matthias remained in his seat even after everyone had left. She then realized that the Duke canoeing with the village kids would be odder. Realizing that she had made a grave choice, Leyla leapt from her seat. The two boats carrying the children had already departed the bottom floor's boat hangar and headed towards the river. The servants were tirelessly rowing while Uncle Bill and Mrs. Grever kept an eye on the children in separate boats. "Teacher! Teacher! Teacher!" The children laughed and waved their hand at her, who was standing beyond the railing. "Teacher, I'll be back." Even the timid Monica grinned with excitement. She could no longer catch up with the children. She was engrossed in her despair when a voice as cold as a river whined suddenly broke the silence. "Sit down." Leyla jerked back. Matthias was looking at her with his legs crossed. "Leyla." He smiled, calling her name as if he was humming along to the tune. "Cry, even better if you beg." Chapter 47. The Duke laughed. A white pigeon flitted from the other side of the river. "Phoebe?" Leyla gasped in disbelief. "Phoebe." She blurted out its name when the bird grounded on the balcony railing. One of its legs was tied with a red thread. It was unmistakably her carrier bird. "Phoebe, why did you fly here?" She went up to the railing where Phoebe was resting. Phoebe's role as a letter deliverer came to an end with Kyle's departure. These days, the bird has become her cherished pet. When the Duke went out for upland hunting, she always confined Phoebe in a cage. But, on the other days, she let that pigeon to roam freely around the Arvis forest. "You can't come here." "Here is." Leyla darted a wary look towards the Duke. They met eyes as his gaze swiveled from the children's boat to her. "Phoebe?" His mention of Phoebe made her flinch. "So the bird's name is Phoebe? Do you know Phoebe?" "Well." Matthias tilted his head. "Just ask the pigeon." "Pardon?" "Didn't you claim you understood the bird's mind?" "That's." Leyla was tight-lipped, unable to say anything more than a grimace. Matthias felt quite satisfied upon seeing her bite her lips because she couldn't debate him. With her back fully turned, Leyla whispered a few more words to her bird as if they could communicate with each other, but Matthias was certain she was mocking him without needing to hear her mutter. Phoebe began gliding towards the other bank of the river. After the bird was out of her sight, Leyla returned to her chair with a sense of alertness. She looked at Matthias with some trepidation before deciding to speak. "I'm sorry, Duke." She abruptly uttered words out of context. "I apologize in Phoebe's stead for recklessly entering your annex and leaving." "You'll apologize in the bird's stead?" "Yes." Leyla gravely replied to his scoff. "I don't know why it came here, but I'll train it to make sure that this never happens again." So, Duke." She began to sweat, her fear was audible. Please don't shoot Phoebe." Only fear remained deep in her eyes as all her bewilderment and curiosity dwindled. Matthias kept mum, his crooked smirk on his lips seeming to fade as he stared into hers. "Please." As his silence prolonged, Her tone was heavily laden with desperation. "Of course, I know you are Arvis's owner, but Phoebe." Leyla kept pleading though her pride was in pain. She was ready to beg once again, but a servant appeared in front of them, pushing her to clamp her trembling lips. Matthias left the balcony after the servant informed him he got a phone call from the company's lawyer. Leyla hardly took her eyes off of him through the window. Her mind was imprinted with the horrors of his countless bird killings. She couldn't relax unless he promised that he wouldn't shoot Phoebe. Matthias returned shortly after. Leyla no longer avoided his eyes like she used to. Instead, she stared at him with persistence. "Duke, Phoebe, I'm not interested in your bird." Matthias flatly cut off her vexing pleas. She heaved. "What do you mean? A target that doesn't run away? It's boring." "Then are you not going to shoot?" Leyla's eyes sparkled brighter, revealing hope and optimism. Her piercing gaze put Matthias in exasperation. Ever since Leyla Lewellin set her foot in Arvis, this was the first time they had eye contact that lasted this long. "What do you think?" Matthias asked back without averting his gaze. He had no intention of hunting the carrier bird in the first place, but he was unwilling to give her a straightforward answer. For the first time he saw her like that, willingly clinging to him in order to beg for something. "I don't think you will shoot." "Why?" "That's because you're a gentleman." "PFFT, you only call me a gentleman when you're at a disadvantage." Matthias let out a vexed laugh at her hasty and brash answer. Leyla hurriedly added on to her words in anxiety. "I don't think you're the type of person to hunt boring targets." "Really?" "Yes." Leyla nodded along with her praise. "Your title is the greatest marksman and gentleman in Carlsbad. I'm sure you won't shoot Phoebe." Seeing her squirming as she talked, Matthias's laughter suddenly cracked up. The servants behind him exchanged conundrum glances, especially Mark Evers, his longtime assistant. He was the most stunned of the others at the balcony. Not because Duke Herhardt didn't laugh much, but those in his immediate vicinity knew that his courteous laughs were mostly a display of civility towards others. Even as a little boy, if Mark Evers' memory served him right, the Duke seldom laughed in a pleasant way. The boats heading downstream now had turned their bows back to the annex. The children's excited laughter and chatter mingled with his chortle. Leyla seemed eager for a definite answer, but Matthias continued to stay silent. He did nothing more than spectate her as she repeatedly wetted her lips in a panic. And she spoke up first. Duke, come and read on our website, Wuxia World site. Thanks." Both her voice and eyes wavered, but not in a fearful way. Matthias did think her rosy cheeks, flushed with anticipation, were very attractive. Her eyes and delicate poise stated she wasn't trying to miss even the slightest of his facial expressions and body language. Matthias changed his mind about answering and instead rang the bell. One of the house staff rushed into the living room at his errand and brought out an ashtray and a pack of cigarettes. "Duke," Leyla urged him on. She needed an answer. Phoebe was a bird she had been raising from its fledgling age. Beyond everything, that bird was like a symbol of her and Kyle's beautiful time they had spent together. She didn't ever want to lose Phoebe, even if those days would never return. Matthias took out a cigarette from the silver case and lighted it up. The thin layer of smoke slowly floated between their deliberate silence. The white puff played in her face. Matthias didn't dislike her outlook, who only looked at him and begged him. It would be great if this moment could continue to last forever, he thought, quite pathetically. "Well, I should stop here for now." As he soon nodded his chin, Layla's eyes glistened. "Phoebe, you're really not going to shoot Phoebe, are you?" Her questioning was very persistent. Matthias turned aside and flickered his cigarette ash. After attentively watching his gesture, Leyla grasped his meaning and retreated without pestering him further. She hardly believed his promise, but there were other servants on the balcony listening, so she felt positive Matthias would keep the promise he made with a lot of eyes watching him. She didn't know or care about Matthias von Herhardt, yet she had that feeling of trust in him. Leyla finally could sigh with relief and glance out of the railing, to the river beyond. The tranquility of the flowing river reflected the shadow of the forest with its autumnal leaves. Her lips draped in a smile. She had managed to protect Phoebe, as well as her precious memories. Her smile lit up as her relief grew. Matthias's eyes narrowed at her odd expression. What good is it to guarantee the safety of a pigeon? He was unable to understand her, yet he couldn't take his eyes off of her face. The cigarette he was holding between his long fingers burned slowly. A sense of unidentifiable annoyance and anxiety rose within the smoke. Both satiety and hunger battled each other to overtake him. The uncomfortable and queer feeling he had was as vivid as the vibrant colors of the season, which dyed the entire world. And as fake as the dream of last night when he opened his eyes. Matthias threw the cigarette in his hand into the ashtray. He was thirsty, perhaps from smoking a cigarette he didn't enjoy, but instead of taking a glass of water, he took out a new one. The unlit cigarette's tip, loosely wrapped between his fingers, slightly shook along with the wind. Leyla turned her head when she felt his stare on her. A smile still lingered on her beaming face. An emotion that shined more vividly than anger and fear, shame and tears could ever have. Matthias was pondering about what that emotion was when Leyla ripped away her smile with haste. She avoided his gaze and bowed deeply. She was only looking down at her fingertips, but Matthias felt quite humiliated at her actions. Humiliation. Leyla Lewellin had taught him the emotion that he now knew for sure. Look at you now, Leyla. Matthias unknowingly laughed in vain. Now that you've reached your goal, you're ignoring me again? He never knew Leyla Lewellin could act this sly. Her attitude was daft, yet it was also pretty cute. But her abrupt mood swings really displeased him. Matthias squeezed his unlit cigarette and tossed it again into the ashtray. After the sunshine-like mirth had disappeared, the terrace was just left in a dark shade. The gloomy place. He didn't like it. The autumn picnic ended when the children were taken to school and safely returned to their homes. Leyla noticed tiredness had strained over her body the entire day. Her muscles were drained, which made her sleepy, but she was happy with her first picnic with the children. Ironically, the person she was most worried about was the key factor to the success of their autumn picnic, Duke Herhardt. For the time being, I think Lady Brandt will be the most envied woman in the world. Mrs. Grever sighed while walking beside Leyla. She will have both that handsome gentleman and the whole of Arvis. The world is so unfair at times like this. Do you know when they are getting married? I heard it's around next summer. It will be a grandiose wedding that will stir the whole empire. Ah. I really envy her. Leyla just gave a moderate smile at Mr. Grever's overblown admiration. They split ways at a downtown junction. Leyla returned to Arvis after buying an armful of groceries. She was going to cook a delicious dinner for Uncle Bill, who had provided her a great help. I'm going to make lots of my uncle's favorite food. Impatience drove her steps faster. She started speed walking after entering the road leading to Arvis. But suddenly, her feet froze in the middle of the road when a middle-aged lady came from the opposite side. That woman also simultaneously stopped as she saw Leyla. That person's eyes was evocative of Kyle, Mrs. Etman. Her hands, holding the grocery bag, turned pale. What should I do? Leyla stood frozen in front of her eyes regardless of how hard she thought. It felt weird passing by her like a stranger, but even weirder to greet her. After much hesitation, Leyla dipped her head in greeting without uttering a word, and Mrs. Etman accepted it with a silent nod. But as the stifling moment was about to end, Mrs. Etman opened her mouth. Leyla swiveled in shock. It ended up like this, but I really don't regret it. Mrs. Etman sighed as she stood in front of Leyla. Neither hostility nor guilt contained in her eyes, they were as lifeless as a clump of leaves. Even if my reputation fell to the ground and my relationship with Kyle turned sour, I still hindered your marriage. That's all I need. Perhaps, Leyla would feel much better if Mrs. Etman's tone was hostile. Each word Mrs. Etman uttered calmly in a tired voice pierced her heart like a shard of glass. After finishing what she had to say, Mrs. Etman started walking and passed her. The housekeeper, standing at a distance with a flustered face, followed her suit. Leyla hurried her way after giving a silent salute to the housekeeper, who threw a look of consolation and compassion towards her. She walked boldly and with a broad stride, then stopped like a toy with a loose spring. She peered down at her 2 feet on the ground, stretched her hand, and took a deep breath. Am I really a human? A sense of shame entered her thoughts. Leyla slowly opened her closed eyes and started walking towards the cabin where Uncle Bill was waiting. Cry, even better if you beg. Chapter 48. Platanis Road. A white pigeon landed gently on the balcony's railing. Folding its wing, the bird naturally approached the feeder and pecked its food deliciously, doused in the golden light of the fading sun that seeped in between its white feathers. Phoebe. Matthias blurted out its name after seeing that bird perched on his window. Phoebe, what a grand name for such a bird. His sneer at that bird-crazed woman flowed softly like a sigh. Matthias rose from his sofa and opened the balcony door. The river winds, blowing near the sunset, bore the damp and chilly air with him, playing in both up-tempo gusts and gentle lulls. When he went close, the pigeon continued to eat its feed, undisturbed. That docile bird's personality contrasted sharply with that of its owner. Softly, the evening came with the sunset while he was leaning against the railing. Matthias closed his eyes so he could hear the wind whispering. Their dulcet tones became a feast for his ears. The gentle rustling sound of the autumn leaves, falling and dancing in the quiet, beautiful forest bloomed like a soothing lullaby. Everywhere he looked, he could only see Leyla in Arvis's autumn. He watched her diligently go to work by pedaling her bike and returning home with a tired face. In her spare time, she volunteered to do the gardener's work and sometimes scoured the forest with her big basket to collect mushrooms and wild berries. In his beautiful cage of Arvis, everything he had in this world stayed in its proper place. That perfect world satisfied him. More than enough to erase the disillusionment he tasted last summer after helping Linda Ettman stop Kyle and Layla's marriage. Leyla, she should be where she deserved to be. As he opened his eyes, Matthias could feel a semblance of satisfaction spreading over his system like a pleasurable intoxication. The stuffed pigeon soon left the balcony and flitted to the cottage, going back to its owner. He believed that the bird would come here again tomorrow and the day after. He had no interest in the bird's feelings, but he knew well how to tame it. To earn that carrier bird's heart, he just needed to provide the bird a safe place and let it eat to the fullest. It was a trick he had honed while serving in the military. Soldiers often used carrier pigeons to deliver messages when communication devices were poor, or there was a risk of information being leaked to the enemy. He was currently using the same method the military bird trainers used to tame Phoebe. Layla's carrier bird, Phoebe, realized there was no use in flying to Kyle Ettman's tightly shut window. A new food source had appeared, and the place was safe, so unhesitatingly, Phoebe would fly to his annex from now on. That bird was quite clever, unlike its foolish and clumsy owner. Matthias looked at the flying bird and suddenly frowned. His memory slithered back to the autumn picnic day, when her smile faded to nothingness the moment their eyes met. But it's probably a smile you've countlessly shown to the doctor's son. The annex shade that shrouded the balcony became darker when his train of thoughts jumped to that conclusion. Ever since Leyla was a child, never once had she smiled in front of him, nor could she hold back her tears. So he made her cry. If he couldn't make her laugh, he would have made her cry. Whether it was her smile or her tears, he was satisfied with everything about her. If all he could give her were tears, then he would make her shed them. He was also willing to break her heart. But what if he could give me something else? These days, Matthias often falls into such a reverie. He no longer wanted to see her being scared or angry at him. He simply wanted her to look only at him. Sometimes humoring him and smiling at him full of overwhelming bliss after he granted her wish. Now, he knew his desire. Leyla Lewellin. He lusted for her. All of her. Everything about her. You've gained weight, Phoebe. Leyla tutted as she peered at Phoebe snuggling in her hands. She mistook it for a puff of thick feathers preparing for the winter, but as she got a closer look, it was apparent that Phoebe had gained some weight. Is it because it's fall? Cuckoo. 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 Leyla kept questioning Phoebe, but the bird seemed to ignore her. Where are you eating now? You don't even have Kyle now. Her last words, she unintentionally said, left her stunned. Tears welled up in her eyes whenever his name came out. No, it's fine. Don't cry. Leyla tried to keep her tears from spilling out of her eyes. They had promised to take care of themselves, and she would do her best to keep that promise. She calmed herself down by taking a deep breath and then released her chubby Phoebe. That bird roamed around the yard for a while before flying to the far side of the forest. It was an ordinary day. She diligently finished her morning routine and went to work after seeing off Uncle Bill. The sound of her winding bicycle chain clicking along the Arvis road, splendidly carpeted with autumnal leaves, creating a noisy tune. Teacher, come and read on our website Wuxia World site. Thanks. Students who recognized her waved their hands as she entered the road in front of the school. Leyla dismounted her bike, greeted the children, and walked into the school. It was an ordinary day, but she felt a bunch of happiness. The children were much more obedient than usual, and they scored well on their mathematics and spelling tests. The languid warmth of the classroom she loved, the lunchtime chatter with Mrs. Grever she enjoyed, and the cloudless, bright blue sky beyond the window. She smiled. Leyla steeled her heart and smiled brightly every time she was reminded of Kyle at waking or on her way home from work. But, as she got closer to Arvis, she could no longer ignore the memories she shared with him as they walked through the streets together. Loneliness suddenly swallowed her up, taking what was once her inner light and replacing it with a darkness that overshadows each moment. Leyla stopped her bike on the side road. She felt helpless. The myriad of memories gliding above the road snowballed into a deep regret. They couldn't live like brother and sister for the rest of their lives, as they weren't related by blood. Nor could they live as best friends as man and woman. But they never knew their relationship was meant to end in separation from the very beginning. They never once expected that they would love, get hurt, and become like this in the end. As her vision began to blur, Leyla squirmed and bit her lip. She encouraged herself, closing her eyes as if she was enchanting a spell. I'll be fine. I'll be fine for sure, so please take care of yourself, Kyle. Fortunately, she was able to contain her sobs and continue pedaling her bike. A black car approached from afar and eventually brushed past her. Matthias made the driver pull over the car at the entrance of Platanis Road. After telling his aide to go back first, he was then left alone on the road. Just like the day when last summer had begun. He took a leisurely walk, waiting for the approaching figure. The fallen leaves rustled underneath his shoes. When the sound of a bicycle running through the road was faintly heard, Matthias naturally slowed down his pace. He turned around at the same time Leyla stopped her bike at an appropriate distance from him. The expected scene unfolded before his still eyes. Leyla was in front of him, along with her bicycle. Hello, Duke. Herhardt. Leyla awkwardly greeted him after glancing around. Her braided, curled hair was half loose and fluttered in the wind. She didn't seem to have a knack for dressing up, as her hair was always tied too neatly or too loosely like today. Still, he quite liked her clumsy appearance. Matthias nodded his head in a straight posture, one hand behind his back. Leyla blinked her emerald eyes while holding tight her bike's handlebars. Whatever she did, she always looked uptight whenever she encountered him. Well then. Excuse me. After bowing, Leyla dragged her bicycle past him and kept walking. You have to act like a proper lady, Leyla, Matthias warned, staring at her back. Leyla had just hopped on the saddle when she flinched and pulled back the bike she was about to pedal. You know that. If you want me to be a gentleman, you need to behave like a lady. Matthias slowly approached her, who could neither get off the bike nor step on the pedal. He continued, and I need to be a gentleman for your bird to be safe. Leyla immediately turned her head. She frowned and stepped off her bike. Matthias smirked as he tilted his head and peered down at her. Her moist eyes looked petrified, but her dainty twisted lips voiced displeasure and defiance. What a cranky woman. After a long stare at her, who pathetically trembled at his joke, Matthias walked forward as if nothing had happened. Having no other choice, Leyla dragged her bicycle and followed him from behind with a heavy stride. Matthias sighed and turned around. I never asked for you to act as my mate. Leyla, who grimly looked down at her toes and followed him like a shadow, suddenly raised her head, taken aback. Yes? Ah. Despite her stubbornness, she was smart enough to understand what he meant. She quickly took a couple more steps towards him. Her gloomy expression conveyed her displeasure, but they were still one step apart. Matthias scoffed as he got his wish and stepped back. As he began to walk again, Leyla carefully matched his pace. With a bicycle between them, they strolled side by side on the Platinus road. There were no words spoken between them. The refreshing evening breeze was filled with only the sound of bicycle wheels spinning and falling leaves being tramped. He was a man who walked very slowly with those long legs of his. Leyla meekly glanced at him after turning her eyes at the road that seemed to be fading away. He was a languid man, but his pace was especially slow today. She wasn't sure whether she was feeling that way because of the awkward situation. He was a man of similar height as Kyle, but he gave off a bigger and domineering presence. She reasoned, it might have been because of his straight, elegant posture and distinctive eyes. His physical appearance also looked firmer and broader than Kyle. Maybe that's why he seemed so different. Leyla made her own findings and deliberately moved her gaze upward. She observed his white, smooth hands, his dark gray suit, his delicately shaped tie, expressionless lips and his eyes. His sapphire eyes noticed her gaze and beheld her. Leyla suddenly was seized with instinctive fear. She meant to bend her head, but her mind wandered elsewhere. As he thoroughly looked into her eyes as if he was captivated, Matthias opened his lips. Cry, even better if you beg. Chapter 49. Like a wing. This hairstyle doesn't suit you, Matthias immediately said the moment their eyes met. His remark startled Leyla. Momentarily bewildered, she mused over his words, grasping the mocking nature of it in an instant. This man. Is he trying to pick a fight again? I know. My hair's a little untidy, Leyla said sharply, in response to his unsought criticism. A little? Matthias scoffed, eyes scrutinizing her from top to bottom. Under his disdainful stare, Leyla squeezed at her bike handles, fighting the urge to run away. Her inability to restrain the strange emotions stirring in her heart as she stood in front of him was already upsetting to her. Leyla refused to look like such an easy target, blushing at just the sight of a man. Why don't you untie your hair? I'd like to, but they said I won't look like a proper teacher. Who? He asked, forehead creasing with suspicion. The headmistress, Leyla replied. As his eyes lingered on her, she averted her gaze, cheeks heating up into a rosy red. She said that if I looked too young, I wouldn't seem like a teacher with authority, she continued hesitantly, fearful that the profound silence between them would make things even more awkward. So the headmistress advised me not to have a student-like hairstyle. Matthias burst into laughter the moment she stopped speaking, a faint chuckle that sounded like a soothing breeze. Ears burning, she continued to avert her gaze, feeling like a fool. With a scoff, Matthias looked down at the petite woman standing before him. So that windswept, tied-up hair is a symbol of a teacher's authority, he drawled, full to the brim with sarcasm. Hurt pride flashed across her face, and he drank in the coy yet cute expression. I'm practicing a lot, so I'll get better at styling my hair soon. Her quick retort, filled with the same pride he saw, left him momentarily transfixed. This woman never wants to give in even if it kills her, doesn't she? Amused by her persistence, Matthias smirked once more. Well then, let's see. I'm absolutely sure that I can do this. And if my skill doesn't get any better, I'll just cut it short. Cut it? The beam fell off Matthias's face at her words. When he saw Leyla nodding, absorbed in thought, his eyes narrowed as if he was witnessing something truly horrible. Yes. I'd look a lot more mature, and don't cut it. His demand was oddly soft and calm. Puzzled and annoyed, Leyla shot him a look. Don't tell me, I need your permission to grow or cut my hair? She groused. Your hair. It's beautiful. It was a stupefying reply to an irate question that was nearly impossible to believe. Above all, it sounded ridiculous. Doubting her ears, Leyla frowned at him. Matthias looked back at her, calm in the face of her agitation. It's like a wing. His voice had taken on the same exact tone he had used to insult and hurt her with merely a single statement in the past, a cold bleakness that reminded her of winter. Leyla could still recall how calm and unchanged his voice had been, even as he was calling her terrible slurs. As she stood fuming in anger, Her memory flashed back to the day of their first meeting. It had been a hot summer day when she first saw Duke Herhardt at the top of a tree, his voice cold yet eerily tranquil even as he came dangerously close to shooting a child. His soothing voice had been imprinted in her mind ever since. Clear as crystal, she remembered jumping down from the tree and running towards Uncle Bill's cottage, crying out at the existence of such a human being. Though there's a man in the forest. A tall man. Struggling to catch her breath, the words poured out of her mouth, full of admiration in a way that only a child could have. He has black hair, and his eyes are blue. And his voice is as light as a feather. At that moment, struggling to explain the texture of the voice that had left her smitten, the only image that came to little Layla's mind was her most precious possession, the soft feathers that belonged to the river birds from Shelter River, which she had painstakingly collected during her many walks along its banks. Anything else would have came up short when compared to his voice. Flustered by his bluntness, Leyla hurriedly avoided his gaze. Cruel and aimed to hurt her, Matthias's words had made him the person she most feared and disliked. After all, it was the Duke Herhardt whom she knew of. However, no matter how long she waited, Matthias stayed silent. Not a word or insult flew past his lips. Instead, he simply walked away, leaving a bewildered Leyla behind. As the autumn leaves fluttered to the ground, she fretted, wondering if his odd compliment was but a hallucination, brought on by the autumn leaves falling gently to the ground. Her hair had cascaded down to her shoulders, strands fluttering in the cold autumn wind. Shaking away her thoughts, Leyla combed a hand through her hair. She flinched as a sudden gust of cold wind blew past her. Losing her grip on the handle, she tried to grab at it, only to crash into the ground with her bicycle in tow. Her scream blended with the thud of her bicycle colliding with the pavement, a cacophony in a quiet road. Matthias grimaced as he watched Leyla struggle to stop her own bicycle from crushing her into a pancake against the dusty road, unaware of his lips quirking up into a laughing sneer the longer he watched. "You trip and fall just like always, it seems." Leyla bit her lip in shame at his laughter. Oddly enough, it made her feel relieved. Just laugh, harass me, and leave. Full of hope, she waited for him to do just that. As Matthias quietly pulled up her bike and walked towards her bag, which had landed far away from where she had fallen, her hopes began to falter. And it died completely when he brought it to her, kneeling at her side. No. No, it's mine." Leyla snatched the bag from Matthias in a blind panic when he attempted to pick her scattered belongings. I'll do it myself." Matthias's brows scrunched together at her blatant hostility. I'll do it," Leyla mumbled. Lowering her eyes, she began to collect her belongings with trembling hands. Even though Matthias had done nothing to frighten her so. Even though he was agitated by Leyla's actions and quivering tone, Matthias decided to watch her patiently. Noticing her flushed cheeks and neck, he had an epiphany. It was merely embarrassment and shyness that made her shy back from him, nothing more. Standing in front of her, Matthias's looming figure casted a shadow onto Layla's dropped items. She appeared very distraught, he observed, gathering even roadside leaves and stones into her bags in her frantic scramble to gather her belongings. Oddly enough, the quirkiness of it all quelled Matthias's ire. Come and read on our website Wuxia World site. Thanks. When she had gathered all of her belongings into her bag, Leyla rushed to her feet. Oblivious to the dust that was all over her clothes and hands, she shot him a look. "I know it's rude, but Duke." Her eyes drifted between Matthias and the entrance to the mansion located on the opposite side of the road. Perplexed, she wondered what to do next. "If it's rude of me to go ahead of you, I'll wait for you to leave first." Her words were bold, as if she no longer wanted to walk with him, but Matthias could see the anxiety in her eyes. She had a nosy attitude, but for once he tolerated it, knowing that he wouldn't be able to walk alongside her after passing the entrance of the mansion. "Go on." His permission surprised her. "Me first?" she asked, full of confusion. Matthias clicked his tongue in lieu of an answer. Layla's face lit up, and she quickly lowered her head. "Thank you, Duke." Matthias seemed offended with her excessive politeness, as if it was an affront to his very being. Leyla made her way to the entrance. Before mounting her bicycle, she halted in her tracks, turning back to the man with the frown, eyes full of suspicion. It was obvious that Matthias was being oddly kind towards her, but she still didn't trust him. After a quick glance, she tilted her head and turned her back to him, riding off down the road. Should I have made her cry instead? Matthias's regret came too late. Keeping a relatively pleasant expression on his face, he kept walking until something shiny on the ground caught his attention. It was a pen that belonged to a woman who fell and lost her belongings with ease. Swiftly, Matthias picked it up. As he kept his gaze on the woman in question, his grip on the pen grew tighter. Momentarily, he considered stopping her. Leyla was close enough that she could hear him if he called, but Matthias stayed silent instead. He spun the pen with his long fingers as he strolled along the road. Meanwhile, Leyla, who was diligently cycling her bike, soon disappeared from sight beyond the Arvis's gate. That bird came again. Smiling, Mark Evers informed the man seated facing away from the window. Despite the lack of explanation, Matthias understood. He didn't even bother to look at the window. He didn't need to. Not when it had happened so often that it had become a part of his daily routine. It was time for Phoebe's visit, a pigeon that was much gentler and smarter than its owner. Leaning against a chair by the fireplace, Matthias signed the last document required of him for the day, handing it to his aide. After his aide retreated from the room with the paper, he was left to his own devices in the living room. Capping his fountain pen, Matthias glanced out of the window. Phoebe, as always, was seated on the railing, preoccupied with gulping down its food with gusto. He looked away from the bird, gaze falling onto the thin pen in his hand. He examined it carefully, noting the pen owner's name engraved in gold on the cap. Leyla Lewellin. The pen appeared to be brand new. It didn't look like she had bought it with her own money, so it had likely been a gift from the gardener. Matthias hoped so. He was sure that Leyla would do everything she could to get it back if it was a gift from Bill Rimmer. Would she have noticed by now? Matthias stared at the pen with a crooked grin. He uncapped the pen. Acting like a gentleman towards a woman who had praised him didn't seem like a bad idea. Besides, it was time for the pigeon to pay for its own meal. Matthias walked up to the balcony, folding a letter containing a single short sentence. Chuckling at the thought of the bird's owner fleeing on her bicycle, he tied the letter onto the bird's ankle, which leant its body docilely towards him. After Matthias made sure that the note was secure, he launched Phoebe into the sky, and the carrier pigeon began to fly eagerly towards the gardener's cottage. Once the sun, gleaming like copper, settled behind the horizon, night came. Along with Phoebe's return. Leyla was sitting and staring mindlessly at the empty desk when the sound of pecking on the window startled her. Turning her head, she called the bird in chidingly. Phoebe. Leyla hurriedly wrapped the shawl over her shoulders, standing from her chair. The chilly wind blew into the room as she threw open the window. Are you hungry? Wait a minute. Huh? Her eyes widened with astonishment at the sight of the letter tied to Phoebe's leg. She rubbed at her eyes, sure that she was seeing things, but the letter remained present on the bird's leg. Kyle? Without thinking, his name slipped from her lips, even though she knew it wasn't him. No, Kyle has already left. There's no way anyone else would tie a letter to Phoebe's feet. Leyla stared blankly at Phoebe. Hands trembling, she opened the letter. As she skimmed through the short sentence written in the letter, her countenance quickly changed from curiosity to dismay. She gasped. The letter slipped from her fingers as she took an instinctive step back, fluttering gently onto the floor beneath the window. Staring at the letter, eyes blinking rapidly, Leyla took a step back, then another until her back slammed against the closet, bringing her to her senses. It can't be. Leyla mumbled shakily under her breath as she rummaged hastily through her bag. The pen she was searching for was nowhere to be found. Even more baffling were the stones and leaves inside her bag instead. She hadn't the slightest idea how they had gotten inside her bag. Leyla frowned and staggered back to the window, letter held in a hand that was now pale and wan like moonlight. Where's your pen, Leyla? Wrapping her arms around her head, she read the note Phoebe had brought in once more. She sighed. No way. No matter how many times she muttered the words, Leyla knew nothing would change. Coo. 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 In the pale white moonlight of an autumn night, Phoebe, the pigeon whom the Duke had fed to the point of rotundness, cooed calmly. Cry, even better if you beg. Chapter 50. For my precious cousin. Arvis was bustling with the preparations for Herhardt's dinner party. As Leyla walked home from school, the roads were swarming with carriages and vehicles. Uncle Bill had been extremely busy these past few days, engrossed in arranging flowers for the mansion's interior. It was that time of the year when flowers start wilting, so he had to gather some from greenhouses and procure the rest from local flower gardens. Leyla helped her uncle out by making frequent trips downtown to buy flowers. Her hectic days made her feel lucky. At the very least, she could forget about her missing pen and her unanswered letter from the Duke. But now that her work was done, she had to return to Arvis. As the entrance to the mansion loomed closer, Leyla slowed her pace. Fortunately, Duke Herhardt seemed to have brushed the matter aside. Or more likely, he didn't have a chance to ponder over it. He, too, had been swamped with work lately, and Phoebe, who had been secretly communicating with him, was confined within a cage in the backyard. I can't believe it. She had uttered these very words at least 100 times since Phoebe brought in the Duke's letter. How did he come up with the idea of taming Phoebe and using it as his carrier bird? She hadn't lived a long life, nor was she acquainted with many people. However, within her lifetime, Duke Matthias von Herhardt was by far the most strange and yet enigmatic man Leyla Lewellin had ever come across. Why does he keep taking other people's things? Is he a kleptomaniac? Leyla kicked an innocent stone on the path as she grumbled. She didn't want to meet the Duke, even though she needed to get her pen back. She didn't really know why she was determined to avoid him even more now, but Leyla felt like she had to. Just as Leyla was about to enter the mansion from a side entrance, a blaring honk startled her. She swiveled to see the Brandt family's car park right in front of her. As the backseat window slowly rolled down, Leyla approached the car with stiff steps. "Leyla, long time no see." Sitting inside was the familiar face of Claudine Brandt. "How have you been?" Claudine beamed, scanning Leyla from head to toe. Leyla froze for a moment. A familiar sense of guilt, like that of a child who had made a grave mistake, gripped her tight. It was the same emotion she had felt last summer, on the day of Duke Herhardt and the ladies' engagement ceremony. The memory of her first kiss being stolen by Claudine's fiancé never failed to make her feel pathetic. The Duke's gentle voice, his soft laughter, and the touch of his firm, fervent hands flitted across her mind, but Claudine's gaze brought her back to the present. Clasping her frozen hands together, Leyla, as she'd always done, greeted Claudine with a polite bow. "Hello, Lady Claudine." It was a surprise to no one that Herhardt's dinner party had ended on a perfect note. Always the epitome of grace and elegance, the two hostesses of the party were consistent throughout. In the Berg Empire, the name Herhardt had earned the epithet perfection. A mishap in Herhardt's dinner party would merely heighten everyone's unbridled curiosity. "Would it be all right if we took a walk in the greenhouse for a while?" Claudine politely asked Elise after everyone had moved on to chat in the living room. Standing on the other side of the room were the people Claudine had referred to, her fiancé and her cousin. "Of course, go ahead." Elise von Herhardt readily consented. "You young people do need to spend some time together." With her subtle tone, the ladies surrounding Elise burst into laughter in tandem, as if they were dancing in rhythm. Claudine exited the living room and Matthias together with Riet followed suit, leaving behind the ladies who began gossiping about the youngsters' love affairs. "Oh, Duke Herhardt, Madame Norma granted me permission to expand this greenhouse when I become the Duchess of Arvis," said Claudine, her radiant voice permeating the tranquil greenhouse in the dark. "I see." Matthias's lips twitched with a faint smile. "What do you think?" "I'll go along with whatever my lady wishes." Claudine already knew what Matthias would answer, but she still nodded with a pleasant smile. "You can look forward to it. I'm confident that I can truly love this magnificent greenhouse, Arvis heaven." Claudine walked along the pathway with a spring in her step. Although she was being escorted by her fiancé, Most of her conversations ended up revolving around Riette. Master Claudine had just begun talking about what tropical plants to grow in the expanded greenhouse when a servant arrived to see Matthias. Someone had sought him out to discuss business-related matters. "Come back quickly." Claudine smiled as she let go of her fiancé's arm. "I'll continue my walk with Riette. I always end up as the Duke's substitute for my dear Lady Brandt." Despite his grumbling, Riette willingly lent his arm to Claudine. After Matthias and his servant departed, Claudine and Riette were the only ones left in the greenhouse, surrounded by the soft lull of the flowing fountain. They resumed their prior discussion as well as their stroll. Claudine's visualization of expanding the greenhouse was quite specific. She had already made up her mind about which particular plants to import and how to landscape them. "It seems like you've already become Duchess Herhardt. Your love for Arvis exceeds your love for your fiancé," Riette surmised as he turned to look at her after listening to her ideas. Claudine nodded without a hint of shame. "Either way, I'm still showing love for Herhardt. You two really are something." Riette's laugh was one of defeat. "Matthias is pretty cold. Are you okay with that?" "What do you mean?" "Duke Herhardt doesn't love anyone. He never loved you before, doesn't love you now, and will never love you in the future. Which prestigious nobleman marries for love?" "Some do. It would surely happen if Lady Brandt would simply become my wife." As usual, Riette kept his expression and tone light and casual. Claudine just flashed a smile in response. "Riette, I've been going in and out of Arvis with my mother for 10 years. Claudine turned to look at Riette. "Do you know what that means?" "It means, for 10 years now, the aristocrats of this empire have already fancied you as Duchess Herhardt." "Right, Riette, this is why I like you." Claudine laughed softly and placed her hand back on Riette's arm. Riette calmly escorted his cousin. The subtle tension between them soon disappeared as their casual conversation and laughter flowed back in. "Come and read on our website Wuxia World site." "Thanks. I also want to raise a peacock after I expand this place." Claudine changed the topic while observing the birds in the greenhouse. "Is this the birth of a bird-loving couple?" Riette asked sarcastically. "Riette, the bird is still there, by the way. That pretty little bird who dwells in the Duke's bedroom." "I don't mind. Duke Herhardt ought to have at least some small pleasures. We should respect his wishes." "I hope it stays just at that." "It's not worth your worries. No matter how pretty it is, you can't bestow the title of Duchess to a bird, Riette." "Well, that's true." Riette failed to refute. No matter how much Matthias adored the canary, a bird was just a bird. "Do you know how long a canary lives? Does it have a long life?" he asked. Claudine tilted her head. "I don't know, but I hope that noisy bird doesn't live too long." "Didn't you just say that we should respect the Duke's small pleasures?" "Yes, but if that bird dies, there will be another bird who will entertain Duke Herhardt." "Claudine, I truly want to give my blessings to you and Matthias." Riette laughed absent-mindedly as he gazed at Claudine's face. "You two are such a perfect match." Riette felt a brief pang of pity for Matthias's little bird. The poor bird was bound to hover around the well-matched couple helplessly. Claudine's lips lifted to a natural smile. Seeing her cruel, yet beautiful face, Riette blurted out, "Should I become acquainted with that bird for my precious cousin? I didn't know you had that kind of hobby." "She's not my cup of tea, but she's still pretty." "It won't be easy." Claudine giggled as if she were having a lot of fun. "That bird may look pretty, but she has the pride of a princess." "Huh? Do I look like the type to easily fail?" "No. But I'm indeed curious. Will you be able to become friends with that haughty bird?" Claudine was no longer smiling, her features as cold as the window panes reflecting the moonlight. "If you succeed, I'd be happy to send you a congratulatory gift." "What gift?" "Isn't gratitude and love enough?" Their ostentatious smiles dissipated as the pair's intense stare down grew profound. "Not bad." As the door to the greenhouse opened, Riette let out a low sigh and the pair made their way forward. Matthias had returned. Neither the carrier bird nor Leyla had returned. Everything was exactly the same as it had been prior to him sending the letter. Matthias scoffed as he looked up at the sky, where the white pigeon used to flit about. He laughed coldly, bitter and borderline angry. "You can go back now," Matthias declared to the servant waiting in front of his balcony door. "Then I'll be waiting in front of the annex when it's time for departure." Mark Evers left a polite greeting and returned with the rest of the staff. Left to his own devices, Matthias let his mind wander as he looked down at the tranquil river below his balcony. He believed that Leyla had been too preoccupied with assisting the gardener recently. But now, that was no longer the case. After lifting his cuff to check his watch, Matthias paced up and down his balcony. There was still some time left before his afternoon appointment. Also, it was the weekend, so Leyla Lewellin would probably be in her cabin. Thus, he deduced a fair conclusion and decided to follow through with his plan without hesitation. Matthias walked down the riverside and entered a forest path carpeted with fallen leaves. He was filled with regret. It flooded through him hot and thick, darker than the color of autumn leaves. I should have heard her until she cried. However, he soon found Leyla Lewellin. She was hanging laundry near the cottage's fences. She looked very calm and relaxed, enough to make Matthias seem foolish for restlessly waiting around for the past week. Matthias stood still and watched her with discretion. Leyla continued hanging the clean bedding, her attention entirely focused on her task. She pulled left and right, pulled once again, and then twisted the sheet tight until it was dry enough to hang. Her proud smile added to Matthias' bewilderment. "Huh? Would you look at that?" Lately, he'd been thinking about those words often. She was annoyingly cute yet ferocious, and she always amused him with her quirky attitude. Matthias felt frustrated with himself for being so disarmed by her. Leyla turned around just as Matthias took a step forward. Her body stiffened like a pole as soon as she saw him. So far, he had thought her actions were very adorable, but Matthias now decided to change his outlook. Leyla swiveled and started running. When she disappeared beyond the yard, Matthias realized that she was running away from him. That woman! The sight of her running away as if she had seen a ghost made Matthias scoff. It was amusing to watch and more amusing to think that she believed she could dare run away from him. He withheld his sentiments for now. After he stopped laughing, Matthias began to chase her. Leyla ran out of the yard and towards the harvesting fields on the opposite end of the shelter river. Matthias' strides grew longer, and the gap between the pair narrowed. Leyla looked back in fear, and then she stumbled. She finally got caught under a willow tree near the river. Leyla struggled against him, but Matthias had grasped onto her shoulders tight and caged her between the tree trunk and his body. His hands were blazing as he aggressively grabbed her matted hair. When he looked down, Matthias was greeted by the sight of a tearful Leyla. He smiled. "Where are you going, Leyla?" "Cry, even better if you beg." Chapter 51. Are you a crow? Insane. Leyla belatedly recalled a stark realization about him. Yes. Duke Herhardt is insane. HHH. You must answer me when I ask you a question. Leyla's breathing was ragged as Matthias smirked and tugged at her hair. Unlike the time he chased and slammed her against the tree trunk, his touch was gentle. However, the shame and apprehension of being dragged by the hair muddled her mind and prevented her from noticing his loosened grip. "Leyla." His voice sounded huskier. Leyla tried to step back, but the tree trunk blocked her escape. Although they had both run for quite a while, Matthias' breathing had already stabilized. Meanwhile, Leyla kept panting erratically. As her chest heaved up and down, the sensation of his towering, firm body grew apparent, further adding to her shame. "Why?" Leyla shoved his shoulder roughly, her voice shaking. "Why are you doing this to me?" Realizing that her two arms' strength alone won't be enough to push him away, she twisted her body with all her might. Matthias pressed his chest closer against hers, amused by her futile attempts. He looked pleased to see Leyla's helplessness at the state of their intertwined bodies. "Don't question. Answer me." He looked into her glare, eager and waiting. "Answer me, Leyla." Matthias fiddled with a strand of Leyla's golden hair, slowly wrapping it around his finger. The soft texture of her locks somehow alleviated the displeasure that had consumed him over the past week. It even managed to water down his irritation from Layla's lack of response. "Don't you think it's unladylike to not answer?" Leyla Lewellin. Matthias' grip on her hair gradually gained strength. Overcome with a foreboding feeling, Leyla finally opened her lips in a bout of anger. "I don't know what you're talking about. Didn't my letter arrive?" "I don't know." "Leyla, you better think carefully before you speak." Matthias' lips spread to a wide grin, seeing Layla's eyes tremble with fear. "What do you think I'll do with a useless carrier bird that can't even deliver a letter properly?" You promised," yelled Leyla. "You promised not to shoot Phoebe." "Did I, Duke? I can't seem to understand what you're talking about." Matthias grew more mischievous with the woman who stumbled over her clumsy lies, failing to hide her nervousness. Leyla glared at him briefly before lowering her trembling eyelids. "Sorry. For what?" "You already know. For ignoring my letter, running away, or lying." Leyla flinched as he pointed out each of her mistakes. She looked particularly lovely when she was docile, and Matthias regretted not being able to see her downcast, glassy eyes. "I'm sorry." "That's enough apologizing." Matthias raised her chin. His touch was careful. It had the tenderness of someone handling something delicate. Yet, Leyla shivered at his mere touch. He didn't mind her reaction though, he was already content with her looking at him. "I guess that pen means nothing to you since you're acting like it doesn't exist." "No, it's precious to me." But as Leyla turned to look away, Matthias captured her dainty chin again, turning her gaze back to him. But he didn't want the conversation to be avoided any further. Leyla finally admitted defeat, with her face and hair firmly locked within his grasp. She let out a sigh of resignation. "I really don't understand you." Layla's serene, emerald eyes held Matthias' gaze. Reflected in her beautiful eyes that resembled the lush greens of eternal summer was his shadow. "Why do you keep stealing my things?" Matthias' eyebrows shot up upon hearing her chastising tone, like that of a teacher disciplining a naughty student. Her retort was so ridiculous that it brought a grin to his lips. Besides Leyla Lewellin, no one in the whole empire would dare accuse Duke Herhardt of being a petty thief. "Are you a crow?" she snapped. Her gaze traveled from his jet-black hair to his piercing blue eyes. "A crow?" Her unexpected question made Matthias frown, but Leyla didn't seem the least bit fazed. "You're the one who's always stealing my... I mean, you're the one who did wrong. Why should I be the one who has to go seek you out and beg for my things every single time? It's not fair." Layla's disgruntled voice was a pitch higher than her regular tone. Somehow, it was clearer and more pleasing to the ears, so Matthias willingly listened. "That's why you stayed put this time?" Matthias' lips twitched at Layla's frustration. His unruffled features left her speechless. Leyla had finally mustered up the courage to protest, but the Duke had dismissed her with a simple smirk. "What in the world?" He made her feel foolish. "Leyla." Right when Leyla was about to speak, Matthias had called out her name. His obtrusive voice dampened her resolve. It was a strange feeling that she couldn't really describe. Hence, she promptly opened her eyes and mulled over a possible reply. "Leyla," Matthias murmured, his voice a low hum. When she turned her head to the side, Layla's ear pressed against Matthias' chest. She could hear the faint beating of his heart. She gasped, placing her pale, stiff hands on top of his chest, horrified at the possibility of him feeling her thumping heart. Leyla pushed his shoulders once again, even though she knew her efforts were for naught. When Matthias finally took a step back, Leyla let out a long-held breath. Despite being of timid nature, Leyla Lewellin was gentle, smart, and at times, daring. She was difficult to comprehend but very entertaining to watch. Come and read on our website Wuxia World site. Thanks. Now, please return my pen. Matthias burst into laughter at Layla's abrupt request. "She never disappoints me." "It's gone," Matthias eagerly answered. "I threw it away." "What?" "I didn't think you would look for it." "Then why did you come looking for me?" "Leyla, don't you think I should at least inform you?" Matthias shrugged his shoulders as if she were asking the obvious. "I'm a gentleman." Matthias caressed her hair, still trapped between his fingers. "I'm Carlsbar's best gentleman, acknowledged by Miss Lewellin herself." As he loosened his grip, Layla's hair fell on her shoulders like golden waves. She gave him a disapproving look while staggering backwards. However, as soon as she'd been released, she let out a yelp of pain. Ouch! As the last strands of her hair slipped out of his fingers, Matthias suddenly strengthened his grip. Am I not? He looked elated, even when Layla's eyes went misty from the pain on her scalp. Insane. It's hurt. Leyla struggled to release her hair from his fingers. Chuckling, Matthias played with the tips of her hair as if it were nothing but a toy. I can't believe this deranged psychopath is the head of the great house of her heart. Just when she was about to start worrying about Arvis's future, Matthias abruptly let go of her hair, causing Leyla to trip. Leyla expected to hear his musical laughter at her tumbling figure, but her plummeting vision came to a sudden halt. Before she knew it, Matthias' familiar features filled her view. Only after feeling his arms encircle her waist did Leyla realize that she was looking up at him while being held against his chest. Should I bite him? Leyla felt like a trapped mouse until Matthias casually set her down. His calm, yet sly demeanor caused her to shudder. She quickly ran to the river's edge near the tree, while Matthias paused to check his wristwatch. I'm taking those words back. You're definitely not a gentleman. Absolutely not. Leyla screamed at the top of her lungs. I guess I have a terrible reputation now. Her cheeks flushed with rage as he laughed again, and it reflected in her voice when she declared, I'm serious. Ah, are you? Yes. If you're a gentleman, then I must be the queen. Leyla was bitter at her past self for showering him with such servile praises. Matthias flashed a wolfish grin while fixing the lapel of his disheveled coat, as if to tease her by saying, is that all you have to say? Before he left, Matthias made a theatrical bow, as though he were a servant in the presence of a queen. His subtle jibe left Leyla speechless. Leyla stared at the duke's retreating back, dumbstruck. The man who hunted her down and tormented her like a predator had now left after insulting her in the most beautiful manner. The car was already on standby with its door open when Matthias arrived in front of the annex. He promptly stepped into the car, his prior annoyance and displeasure having vanished into thin air. The car gathered speed as it drove along the riverfront road. Inside, Matthias gazed at the shelter river for a moment before turning to the pile of documents and letters his aide had arranged for him. His twinkling eyes slowly returned to their usual, calculated gleam. However, his stoic visage broke when he slightly pouted his lips as he retrieved a pen from the pocket of his coat. Leyla Lewellin. The golden letters engraved on the pen sparkled in the afternoon sun. Matthias' fingertips softly glided over the pen's glossy surface. Smiling, he opened the pen cap. The scratch of pen against paper echoed throughout the sunlit car. Ms. Lewellin, this is for you. The mailman had a small parcel left in his hands once all the official letters had been given out. For me? Leyla hesitated before receiving a parcel at school rather than at her cabin. When she searched for the sender's identity, she was greeted with a name and an address that she had never seen before. Might this be a wrong delivery? Huh? No. Leyla dismissed her doubts with a smile. Although she didn't know who the sender was, the recipient tag on the box clearly mentioned Leyla Lewellin. Thank you. Leyla hurried back into the school building after thanking the mailman. As the school's youngest teacher, she was tasked with the duty of receiving and distributing all the letters and parcels, from the principal's office to the classrooms. By the time she completed her tasks, break time was almost over. Leyla took a seat at her classroom desk and started unwrapping the package she had received. She found a long box, free of any note or missive. Leyla checked the sender's name and address once again. It was odd, the address mentioned a strange city. Upon sliding the lid open, Leyla sat with her mouth agape. Inside the box was a black pen with exquisite golden etchings. Who on earth would send this and why? But then, the memories of the weekend flooded her mind and she let out an inadvertent sigh. This new pen seemed far too expensive compared to her previous one. Leyla carefully picked up the new fountain pen. Her name was engraved on the cap, just like her old pen that the Duke had thrown away. Before she could do anything else though, her students started pouring into the classroom with the sound of the ringing school bell. Leyla put her new pen back in its box and stowed it deep within her desk drawer. How dearly she wished she could stow away her memories in the same dark place, too. But alas, Leyla knew that was impossible. Let's get started, everyone. Leyla stood before the podium, a jovial smile in place. Cry, even better if you beg. Chapter 52. It's over now. It was late afternoon when Riet von Lindman arrived at Herhardt's mansion, his carriage loaded with luggage for his short stay at Arvis. Welcome, Riet. Leyla von Herhardt greeted him cheerfully. I wish my sister had come with you. My mother is going on a trip soon. She must be planning a trip to the south for winter. Yes, she detests the cold. Riet smiled as he conveyed his mother's regards with a gentle voice. Where's Madame Norma? She's taking a nap at the moment. You may say hello to her later. Leyla von Herhardt led Riet to the living room. As a cousin and a close friend of Matthias, he had wandered in and out of Arvis growing up, and was already considered a part of the family. The two had tea in the living room, after which Riet went for a stroll in the woodlands of the Herhardt estate. Matthias wouldn't return until nightfall, and it would take some time for the servants to organize Riet's belongings. Thus, curiosity got the better of him. Riet decided to set out for a special occasion, to meet the elusive child who lived in the woods, Leyla. In other words, the woman who was wreaking havoc in Matthias and Claudine's once orderly life. Riet knew the child, but he had never spared her a single glance. To him, she was just one of many in the bevy of servants who took up residence in Arvis. He sympathized with her plight and thought of her as quite a pretty girl, but that was all. So imagine Riet's surprise when he discovered that the woman Matthias had taken an interest in was Leyla Lewellin. Scandalous affairs between aristocrats and their servants were nothing new, but if the aristocrat were to be Duke Herhardt, the story would take on a life of its own. Even if it was just a passing fancy. Duke Herhardt lied. As the gardener's cabin appeared on the horizon, Riet reminisced about that evening last summer when Claudine had abruptly brought up Matthias. He lied in order to separate Leyla from the doctor's son. Claudine had smiled, but Riet saw through her facade when he caught a glimpse of her frightening, icy gaze. The blue-blooded Matthias von Herhardt lied and schemed just to have that pathetic orphan. Can you believe it, Riet? Claudine scoffed. What kind of lies did he spew? Riet had asked, but Claudine had given no further explanation. I hope he gets her as soon as possible. Claudine looked out her window impassively, as if nothing had happened. The long, summer sunset split the skyline beyond Count Brandt's estate like a blade of gold. He needs to have her in order to dispose of her at the earliest. Claudine muttered with a look of boredom sketched on her face, as if she were a spectator of a third-rate, low-class performance. Riet could peer right into her mind. She didn't look jealous of Leyla Lewellin. She simply portrayed slight dismay and scorn at her noble fiancé's lowly inclinations. Rather, if Claudine had been jealous or distressed, Riet would have asked her to marry him instead of getting tied to a marriage that would have made her miserable. However, Claudine was adamant that marrying Matthias would be the only way for her to receive the happiness she so desired. That day, the two of them had sat down for tea and chatted pleasantly, later enjoying their dinner in the same amicable atmosphere. The following morning, Riet had left the Brandt estate with Claudine standing at the door until his car was out of sight. Why is that memory persisting and becoming a lingering regret? A forlorn laugh escaped Riet's lips just as he arrived in front of the log cabin. A forest trail linked the hedgeless hunting grounds and the small cottage. Every passing second, the glorious lamp of heaven leisurely dripped gold onto the glittering river. As the sun slowly set beyond the horizon, the lighting inside the house dimmed down. Instead of leaving, though, Riet decided to wait. With his back resting comfortably against the porch railing, he looked up at the deciduous branches. Riet Lindman harbored feelings for someone who would never be miserable because of love. And he knew well that the woman he loved was the root of his woes. Yet, Riet enjoyed having a simple and carefree life, so he was willing to embrace his tragic love with ease. He didn't mind providing Claudine with some fun and helping her through his pranks. Just when he was about to light a cigarette, Riet suddenly heard footsteps coming from the other side of the forest trail. Sounds of conversation floated down the path. He shifted his attention to the direction of the distant sounds and took a long drag of his cigarette. He then exhaled a cloud of smoke as he kept waiting. Before long, a bear-like man and a woman half his size appeared before him. They stopped short of the entrance when they noticed Riet. With a grin pasted on his face, Riet approached the pair. The gardener blurted out a greeting upon recognizing the man, and the petite lady next to him bowed her head. "Hello there, little forest bird girl." Riet greeted her calmly, similar to the time he watched her cry as she buried the bird that Matthias had slain. "Ah. Should I say bird lady now? Or bird teacher?" Leyla's eyes glinted in suspicion behind her glasses, her brows furrowing as she processed his nonsense. Riet's impression of Leyla Lewellin remained unchanged. She was certainly pretty, but not stunningly so that it would dazzle the men around her. Yet, he seemed to have an inkling of how she managed to tickle the fancy of the doctor's son and his very own noble cousin. "Anyway, nice to meet you, Leyla. Be careful of Marquis Lindman." It was a severe warning when coming from Bill Remmer, who was glaring at something towards the end of the table. Leyla giggled, placing down the pot of freshly cooked stew in the middle of the table. "This isn't a laughing matter. Don't just take it lightly, Uncle. Come and read on our website, Wuxia World site." "Thanks. I don't believe that lazy flirt just came out for a walk this far." Bill bit the loaf roughly, tearing it into smaller pieces. "He greeted you and prattled on about pointless things. It's extremely suspicious, so you should be more careful." "Yes, yes," Leyla readily replied, knowing his nagging would never end if she didn't comply. At her half-hearted response, Bill was unconvinced. "Keep my words in mind, Leyla. Not all aristocrats are as decent and dignified as Duke Herhardt." "Yes. Huh, what?" Layla's forehead scrunched up in the midst of her inadvertent nodding. Bill's exaggerated reverence of Duke Herhardt left her speechless, but she could not dissent because except for her, everyone else viewed Duke Herhardt in such light. Leyla just kept nodding as she hurriedly ate her bread, keeping her opinions to herself. Nevertheless, memories of that indecent, undignified man became more vivid. She started coughing, choking on her bread as she remembered the offensive bows and expensive pens he sent to her in school. "What's wrong?" "Nothing." Leyla shook her head. "I was hungry, but ate too fast just now." She took off her glasses, and wiped away the tears that resulted from her violent coughs. Bill burst out laughing as he watched her. "At moments like this, would you still seem like a child?" He had a chastising tone, but Bill's smile said otherwise. "Eat some more. But carefully this time." Bill took a big serving of meat, placing it one by one on Layla's plate. Then another. The food piled up higher every time Bill moved his hands. "This is too much. Don't you know? I like children who eat like cows." Bill, like always, refused to listen to Layla's objections. "I am no longer a child," Leyla declared, yet Bill's only response was adding one more piece of meat onto her plate. Their balmy evening was spent chatting and laughing at the table. Leyla found it difficult to eat like a cow, but she tried to eat enough to please her uncle. Leyla washed the dishes as Bill Remmer mended the squeaky desk chair. Afterwards, the two of them sat on the porch, warm mugs of coffee in hand, and viewed the falling russet leaves. The wind brought on a palpable chill, but Bill and Leyla would continue their day-end conversations for as long as they could until winter arrived. "Good night, Leyla." Bill gave his rudimentary but warm goodbye before entering his room. "You too, Uncle." "Good night." Layla's lips held a gentle smile, as usual. Her bubbly voice had the essence of a sliver of light flowing through the gap of a curtain. After returning to her room, Leyla sat on the chair Uncle Bill had fixed for her and corrected her students' test papers. Later, she read some mystery novels borrowed from the library and replied to letters from friends who had become teachers at other schools. After finishing the last letter, she suddenly remembered the pen the Duke had given her as she closed the lid of her own worn-out one. Leyla was silent for a brief moment as she looked blankly into space, before deciding to open the desk drawer. The pen she had reluctantly brought home was still neatly stowed in its box. "I knew it." Growing up, Leyla had heard many a tongue click whenever she made a mistake or tried to be more well-behaved than her classmates, as one would expect from a child who grew up without parents. The remarks she'd grown used to hearing always carried one of the two emotions, scorn or pity. Leyla always wondered why she was singled out for blame every time, even though the other children made the same mistakes as her. Nevertheless, as she grew older, Leyla realized that society's rules didn't apply equally to all of its members. So she wanted to do better. Even if she couldn't be perfect, she was determined to live a life where she didn't garner sympathy from others. Every time she faced the world's harsh standards, Leyla tried her best to stand her ground and fight. She wanted to live a respectable life for Uncle Bill, who had cared, loved, and raised her in all the ways that count. After she made up her mind, she pulled the pen out of the box without hesitation. Her hand reached for a piece of paper to wrap the package in. Leyla meticulously packed the parcel and scrawled down the address using an old fountain pen. The receiver was the owner of Arvis, Duke Matthias von Herhardt. As for the sender, she wrote down the stranger's name and address from whom she had received the pen. When dawn came, Leyla stuffed the box into her bag and set off for the day's work. She had to leave the house earlier than usual to make a quick trip to the post office in the nearby hamlet. After returning the present, Leyla felt like a heavy weight had been lifted off her chest. Leyla believed it was over now. She was sure of it. Cry, even better if you beg. Chapter 53. The Bird's Owner. My heart aches every time I see this, Matthias. Riet clicked his tongue as he pulled open the cabinet door. Even though he wasn't a big drinker, the minibar in Matthias's room was always stocked with fine liquors. It's not nice to overlook fine liquors in this way. With a vague grin, Riet took a bottle of alcohol and went back to the front of the table. Matthias' expression was bland as always. He didn't give a fig about what his cousin did. The soulful melody of a piano played from the phonograph, perfectly harmonized with the crackling of the logs burning in the fireplace. Riet filled a glass with the liquor from the bottle, handing it to his cousin. Matthias took the glass gracefully, his movement in sync with the notes filling the room. Leaning against the couch, Riet observed him as if he were a stranger. Matthias was staring at the rim of his glass, lost in thought as a canary, which now felt like a part of the bedroom, played happily beside him. Your cousin is a demon of a gentleman. The reputation of Captain Herhardt, spreading ever wider with each social event held, suddenly rose in Riet's mind. Matthias had never spoken about his time serving on the military front, not from modesty, as one might have expected, but from feeling that his accomplishments during that period of time had no meaning. Instead, word of Captain Herhardt's heroics spread through the lips of other aristocratic officers who had battled beside him during the war. Riet might not have participated in the war, but the narratives he had heard allowed him to visualize Matthias's prowess on the battlefield as if he had seen it firsthand. Neither a warmongering idealist like his fellow aristocratic officers, nor someone steeped with the boredom that came from the routine of the military, Matthias' ethos as a soldier at arms was noticeably different from his brethren. His name was etched in gold ink, illustrating his brilliant achievements during his time in uniform. Yet, Matthias deemed it all of little importance. Every time people gossiped about Matthias' military prowess, they invariably concluded their stories with an incredulous sigh. I don't understand him. Riet knew better than anyone else how the discouraging remark was the most apt description of Matthias von Herhardt. I really don't understand. Each person had sighed once they uttered those words, much like how Riet was sighing at the moment. I don't understand him. He had known Matthias von Herhardt all his life, yet the only conclusion that Riet could draw about him was this: the man resembled a rainbow amalgamation that blended into a murky color with a white finish. A noble aristocrat. A worthy successor. A good cousin. A man of honor. Every facet of him was prominent, yet nothing was discernible, even when all of the facets were arranged together. Some praised Duke Herhardt for his self-learnt mastery of self-suppression, especially when it came to carrying out his duties, but Riet was skeptical of their analysis. As far as he could tell, there had never been anything to suppress in the first place. But how would Duke Herhardt act towards Leyla Lewellin? More than a little tipsy, Riet grinned as Matthias gave him a sidelong glance. The canary was now sitting still on Matthias's shoulder, something that Riet believed would make Matthias annoyed. But the man looked unfazed instead. "How long do you plan to be the owner of that bird?" "For as long as I want to." Matthias's answer was quick and resolute. The bird fluttered up to his shoulder, rubbing its beak against his suspender as he took a sip from the glass he was holding. "When will that be?" "Well." Placing his glass down delicately, Matthias leant aslant against the armrest. The warm light from the fireplace reflected off the onyx buttons on his cuffs, gleaming a deep black in the light. "Aren't you curious? Why I came to Arvis, what I'm planning to do, that kind of thing?" "No." Riet's visit to Arvis that came out of the blue, and his impromptu weeks-long stay came as no surprise. Yet Matthias's reply was indifferent, as if he found what he was listening to was nothing more than a pathetic affair. "Whatever, you jerk," Riet laughed, downing the last of his drink. "Is it lust?" Riet looked at Matthias contemplatively. He knew well, men had the instinctive desire to own beautiful women. Despite the lack of emotion Matthias externally, that didn't mean his instinct was gone. It was just a hunch, but Riet felt that it was a reasonable assumption to make with what he knew about his cousin. But why the orphan? Duke Herhardt was always unsympathetic to women who were more beautiful and noble than the orphan. The more Riet thought about it, the more it felt like he was in a labyrinth, increasingly confused by its twisting turns. Riet shoved the thought away as Matthias whistled. The bird, which had been bouncing on the table, flew over to Matthias immediately. Gazing idly at the bird, Riet whistled towards it, tune longer and kitschy. Unfortunately for Riet, the bird showed no sign of coming towards him. It sat on the back of Matthias's hand, tilting its head up towards Matthias instead. "What the? Can a bird recognize its owner?" Riet scoffed as he recalled the woman who had kept a wary watch on him. He didn't view Leyla Lewellin as an elusive woman. No matter how long it took, Riet believed that she would open up to him with time, just like she did to the doctor's son and Duke Herhardt. Not just that, but Riet knew Matthias von Herhardt would abandon the orphan eventually for the sake of his marriage with Claudine, an end result that Claudine had long hoped for. "Shall we go hunting on the weekend?" asked Riet, while refilling his glass. After a moment of thought, Matthias gave a surprising answer. "Go alone. I'll have it prepared for you." "What?" Eyes wide, Riet stared at Matthias. For as long as he could remember, Matthias had never turned down a hunting offer. "No way, are you serious?" A knock on the door interrupted Riet's question. The butler, Hessen, stepped inside the room. "The mail has arrived, master." With a parcel and a tray of letters at hand, he moved smoothly towards Matthias. "Why does the butler have to come in at this hour for such a trifling notice?" "Come and read on our website Wuxia World site." "Thanks." Riet flashed the butler an annoyed glance. The butler's lips were pressed flat, a clear signal that Riet had overextended his stay. "Well then. See you tomorrow, Duke." Toasting a goodbye with a glass of alcohol in his hand, Riet left Matthias's bedroom. After Riet's steps had faded, Hessen opened his mouth, saying, "Master, the parcel has returned." "Parcel?" Hessen awkwardly gave a small box to Matthias. The sender's name and location were unfamiliar. "Who is this?" "It's my relative. I use this name and address to follow your order." "My order?" Ah. Matthias's mind flashed back to the week before, when he had ordered Hessen to send Leyla Lewellin a good pen. Understanding clicked into place at the memory. Master. I understand." Matthias cut Hessen's words short. "You may leave." He tapped his finger on the box he had taken. Hessen stared like he wanted to say something, but followed the Duke's orders without further questions. Matthias rose from his seat once the door had closed. The box was held in his hands, ripped box's wrapper burned into embers in the hearth. Inside the opened box was a note and pen, neatly arranged. Slowly, Matthias read the message, taking his time to read the few scrawled words on the scrap of paper tucked between his fingers. "Come to think of it, it was my fault for losing my pen. It was my fault that I fell, didn't properly pack things, and didn't get it back on time. You don't have to take responsibility. There's no reason for me to receive this item, so I'll return it to you." There was no name written on the message, but Matthias knew who it was anyway. Layla's note was full of familiar conceit. The more Matthias read, the more slanted his eyebrows went, until eventually he snorted and flashed a grimace, edges of his lips curved up in anger. As he watched the fire in the fireplace devour the crumpled note, shiny new pen and the parcel box they were originally wrapped in, self-content, anger, shame and laughter loomed one after another on Matthias's face as he watched the shimmering flame. His expression faded back to neutrality, vanished moments after the vivid emotions mixed into one. The only thing left of his features was the very picture of calmness and serenity, marred only with the shadow of the lamplight growing over it. The class had ended early, but Leyla was still quite busy. It was the day of the school's council meeting. The members were going to discuss the issue of the school's old, small building, which needed to be expanded. As the person in charge of arranging the conference room, Leyla set up the chairs and desks in accordance to the number of people attending, preparing simple writing instruments and notepads for everyone to use before the meeting began. "Miss Lewellin, are you done?" Mrs. Grever asked in a hasty fashion. Smiling, Leyla looked around the conference room for one last time and nodded decisively. "Yes, I'm done." "Then, let's get going. The sponsors are here." "Already?" Leyla scrambled to get ready, following Mrs. Grever as soon as she was done. The sponsors' extravagant carriages and limousines formed a long line as they entered the school's front gate. An ominous premonition flashed through her. She shook her head, as if to deny the feeling. In the numerous times she had read the list of sponsors attending the meeting, Herhardt's name had never appeared in the lineup. She had nothing to be apprehensive about, nothing to worry about save for the gift she had returned to the Duke. That was, and the most likely cause for Layla's erratically pounding heart. Several days had passed since she had returned the gift. The Duke had made no mention of her, no visits, no interrogations, no harassments, unlike his actions from before. Leyla, who had been terrified of encountering such a mishap, could already feel her guard going down. She might have hurt the Duke's pride, but it was something that had to be done once anyway. No matter how irrelevant their relationship was, Leyla had a dim hunch about him. She was aware of the Duke's desire for her and knew she could get harmed. Leyla despised him for every single thing. She hated Matthias von Herhardt. She hated his selfish desires. She hated the repercussions she would face because of his freakish obsession. Leyla had long since lost the desire to be embroiled in irrelevant affairs. And more importantly, she didn't want to get hurt, especially by the Duke, who had gotten wind of her heart after she had returned the gift. As the aristocratic man remained silent, Leyla took it to mean that he had accepted her rejection. Slowly sweeping down her chest, Leyla stood still at the end of the line to greet the sponsors. The autumnal rain had chilled the air. She had been concerned about the poor attendance rate caused by the bad weather. But all the sponsors who had promised to attend were fortunately present. Leyla performed her job well, smiling and bowing politely to everyone she met. She prepared the tea and waited quietly as the meeting started. Layla's first council meeting would be considered successful only when she escorted the sponsors off the premises. The headmaster turned around as the last sponsor, a lady, drove through the school's entrance. A black car that had clearly been in a battle with the heavy downpours squeaked to a stop just as the other teachers were about to do the same. "My God! Duke!" The headmaster's countenance changed from a confused expression to a beaming grin very quickly. Face prepared to smile and greet the guest, Layla's lips quivered. "No way!" Leyla blinked. She blinked rapidly, nervously, as if to deny what she was seeing. Standing there in a distinctive, straight posture under a parapluie held by an assistant was Duke von Herhardt. His eyes wandered through the line of teachers, stopping at Layla's withered face. When their eyes met, the Duke smiled. For those who did nothing more than glance, it was a smile that could only be called gentle. "Cry, even better if you beg." Chapter 54. Taking responsibility. Although Leyla didn't show it, she was thoroughly distracted throughout the entire council meeting. She laughed, she talked, and she moved around, yet her focus was entirely on one person, The one and only Duke Herhardt. What is he doing here? Anyone who caught sight of Leyla's eyes would have to be blind not to notice the mix of curiosity and fear in them, as she studied Matthias's face intently. Matthias attended the meeting as if his sole purpose was to mock her. The principal, however, was excited with the surprise visit from the Duke, and even more delighted when Matthias agreed to develop the school further. Unknown to the principal, Matthias wasn't interested in anything related to the school. The same went for the meeting. What he was interested in was the woman seated in the far corner, trembling as she glanced periodically at him when she thought he wasn't looking. Miss Lewellin. Matthias's smile softened at the sound of a teacher calling her name. Miss Lewellin? The teacher hesitantly called out her name again. As one, everyone in the conference room turned to look at the owner of the name. Matthias followed suit. Leyla was standing still as stone in the corner of the classroom, much like a child being reprimanded. As Matthias continued to stare, Leyla fidgeted nervously, not quite managing to look away from his gaze. Leyla hesitated under the weight of their stares. Full of reluctance, she raised her head, mumbling, Pardon me." The woman trembling and bowing her head repeatedly in apology was the opposite of the woman he remembered, an outspoken, fearless woman who always acted courageously in front of him. It was pathetic. The more Matthias saw her low-spirited attitude, the more Matthias could feel his temper fraying, thread by thread. "Now, Miss Lewellin, please continue." Matthias interrupted the frowning principal as she opened her mouth to complain, voice blunt and gruff. With the expansion proposal, the principal shot him a look, eyes wide. He smiled graciously at her, baring his teeth. "I'd like to hear more about it in detail." Yes. It took only a mention of the new building for the principal to regain her excitement. Leyla's clumsiness was already fading from the principal's mind, replaced instead with new architecture and expenses. As the discussion between Matthias and the principal continued, Leyla helped Mrs. Grever prepare the tea. "Get your head straight, Leyla," she told herself, doing her best to put herself into a calm, trance-like state in an effort to control her nerves. "Stop acting like a fool and behave naturally." Alas, her desperate wish was not to come true. It vanished into thin air without fail the moment she approached Duke Herhardt. Leyla's hands shook with nerves as she held the teacup. Matthias looked at her as the teacup as it clattered on the saucer, following her every move. The more he stared at her, the more emotions hopeless she felt, eyes glazing over with a mix of fear and confusion that increased with every step she took towards him. Matthias had initially attended the school meeting with the expectation of seeing an incredibly flustered Leyla. However, at the sight of her misery, the emotion in his heart was not happiness as he originally thought, but a distorted sort of pleasure. "Cry, even better if you beg." Chapter 55. What must I destroy? I don't think this is the right way to go to Arvis. Leyla was the first to break the silence upon noticing the car speeding through Carlsbar's main street instead of returning to Arvis. She clutched at her bag and coat, grip tightening until her knuckles turned white. "Mr. Evers," she began, addressing the eight seated in the front. "This road, Leyla, I believe I've told you." Matthias abruptly cut her off. "I will take responsibility." Leyla raised her face, shooting Matthias an angry glare. "Take responsibility?" His words replayed in her mind, and her hands clenched into fists with anger. She hadn't heard anything more nonsensical. "I ruined your clothes on purpose. It is only natural that I should be held accountable for it." "No. You don't have to." Why? Are you insisting that I am not in the wrong?" Matthias repeated tenaciously, despite the presence of his aide and the driver, who were seated stiffly in the front of the car. Leyla grabbed her skirt. She took a deep breath. No matter how hard she scrubbed, the red stains on her hands and clothes stayed stubbornly on, as if they were mocking her fury. "That gift. I should immediately throw it away." Leyla bit her lip. Even if it was utterly foolish to believe that refusing the Duke's gift would sever the relationship between them, she couldn't help but think it. Unable to deny how lost she currently felt, Leyla wanted to cry from shame. How? Hoping against hope for an answer, she glanced at the Duke. The look he gave her reflected the bleak cityscape, cold and filled with a tinge of frustration. Hopes dashed, she looked away, breaking her gaze. As the sun hesitantly peeked through a thick layer of clouds, the car came to a stop at a street filled with high-end stores and upscale boutiques. The driver and the aide both exited the car without a word, leaving only the mismatched pair behind. The instant they had left the car, the air in the car became heavier, temperature dropping by a few degrees. Leyla immediately tensed her shoulders. "I'm going to leave now." Grabbing at her umbrella, Leyla hurriedly spun to the side. Before her hand could reach the car door, Matthias forcefully grabbed her wrist. "Where are you going?" "Home. I don't need any clothes. I'm going home." Matthias kept his grip on her wrist without much effort as Leyla instinctively struggled to pull her hand away. "Don't be selfish, Leyla," he said gruffly. "Why aren't you taking Bill Remmer into consideration?" Matthias scoffed, loosening his grip on her wrist. What? What do you mean?" The mention of her uncle was enough to make her struggles stop. "How heartbroken would Mr. Remmer be if he sees you like this?" "I'm surprised that the noble Duke Herhardt is concerned about my uncle after he did this to me." "Well, Mr. Remmer has worked as a gardener for our household for decades. It is only right that I worry for him." Grip tightening on her wrist once more, Matthias pulled her close to him, so close that he could feel her breath against his face. "Are you confident that you can come up with a good excuse when Mr. Remmer asks about what happened to you, upon seeing this pitiful appearance?" "Oh, of course," Leyla stammered. Matthias's hand swiftly grasped her cheek as she tried to free herself from him, leaning in close to her small ears. "Unfortunately, Leyla, I am fully responsible for you," he whispered. "After all your misfortune is caused by me." Matthias's gaze was intense, filled with the obsession she knew he had towards her. Leyla desperately tried to break her gaze, but to no avail. "It is my responsibility to hand you back to Mr. Remmer in perfect condition. Even a single blemish on your clothes will not be tolerated." "And no need. You don't have to. Let me go." Think about it, Leyla. There's nothing wrong with accepting my apologies and receiving your rightful compensation. Don't you think your act of disobedience and stubbornness would appear quite weird?" Matthias's solemn gaze shifted towards the window. The driver and the aide were standing outside, ignorant of the quarrel taking place inside the car. "They might think you're a petulant mistress." Extremely offended by his vulgar joke, Leyla frowned fiercely. Releasing her hand, Matthias smirked, reaching out to knock on the window. Mark Evers nimbly turned around, opening the back door. Leyla quickly leapt out of the door like a bird that was freed from its cage, unwilling to waste her newfound chance for freedom. Matthias glanced at her ruined bag and coat. Gesturing to Mark Evers, Matthias gave brief instructions to the aide, closing the door once he was done. He resumed his staring out of the window. His blue eyes narrowed as Evers attempted to drape his coat over the freezing Leyla. Before Evers could make a move, a faint knock on the window interrupted him. Pulling his coat back on, he swiftly reopened the back door. Matthias took off his coat and handed it to Evers, who obediently took the coat without question. The door slammed shut once again and the only sound inside the car was the raindrops hitting the windows. Matthias's steady gaze never left Leyla, watching as his aide wrapped her, who was too dazed to realize whom the coat belonged to, in his coat. Soon, the driver returned and started the car's engine. Leyla followed Mark Evers into the boutique's fitting room, her hands tightly gripping Matthias's coat. Matthias's gaze lingered on her for a long time. "Why are we going in there?" "Come and read on our website, Wuxia World site." "Thanks." Leyla came to a stop as she glimpsed the luxurious hotel she had been given the privilege to attend last summer, when she had tea with Claudine and Matthias. "It was the Duke's command, Miss Lewellin," Mark Evers explained, smiling. "The Duke informed me that he will only return to Arvis after treating Miss Lewellin to a cup of tea as an apology." "And no, it's fine. These clothes are more than enough for an apology." "Miss Lewellin, it is not for me to decide." "But, Miss Lewellin, I'm simply following the Duke's orders," Mark Evers said, a little baffled by Leyla's attitude. Please don't make it difficult for me to accomplish those orders. Running out of reason to give for her stubbornness, Leyla followed him with heavy steps. Did you know that the Duke is currently raising a bird just like you, Miss Lewellin? Mark Evers blurted out as they entered the hotel lobby. A tiny, pretty yellow bird. A bird? The Duke? Leyla frowned in disbelief. That psychotic bird slayer raises a bird? It was the weirdest thing she'd ever heard, and even more difficult to believe in. Is he raising it to hunt it? The question filled with paranoia left Mark Evers dumbfounded. Before he had a chance to clarify the misunderstanding in his master's stead, they had already arrived to the entrance of the tea room. Mark Evers escorted Leyla to Matthias, who was seated near the window overlooking the rainy terrace, promptly leaving the room the moment his job was done. Seeing Leyla standing blankly without moving an inch in front of him, his stern voice rang. Sit down. Reluctantly, Leyla sat down in the chair opposite of him. She removed her coat, revealing a newly bought turquoise velvet dress with shiny pearl buttons adorning its front, and a wide lace collar that was white as snow. It was clear that everything she was wearing was brand new, from her shoes to the stockings that ended mid-calf. Her hair had also been done up into an elegant yet natural-looking style. Compared to her usual nun-like outfits, Matthias was pleased to see her in a more elegantly styled dress. They were served tea and an assortment of exquisite desserts not long after. Eat, Matthias ordered while holding his teacup. Leyla didn't move, flashing him a look of stern disgust instead. Matthias met her glare head-on, as if it held no threat to him. Shall I feed you? He asked arrogantly. I am more than willing to take responsibility for that as well. At Matthias's declaration, Leyla hastily grabbed her fork. She hesitated only a moment before choosing a light pink cream cake. Satisfied by her obedience, Matthias straightened his posture and continued to observe her. What kind of delicacies do you prefer? Matthias asked curiously, watching her silently savor the cake. She appeared to be a fan of desserts, a fact that was seemingly trivial that nevertheless piqued his interest in her. Save for the foods I have to eat in front of you, everything is to my liking. Leyla retorted coldly, fiddling with the fork handle. Despite her attempt to sound confident, her voice trembled. Matthias's chuckled, little pearl-like bubbles of sound that were soon muffled by the sound of raindrops splattering against the window pane. Did you know that it's your proud attitude which I am attracted to? He leaned towards the table, while saying, my intrigue of you grows when you're cocky like this, believe it or not. If you decide to continue to behave like you do now, then I reckon it won't take long before I am addicted to you, Matthias scoffed, his voice soft like a bird whistle. Petrified by his words, Leyla found herself leaning back instinctively as he bent closer towards her. Wouldn't it be better if you acted innocent and docile? Matthias said, grinning. That way, I might grow tired of you. Matthias leant back in his chair, as if he believed Leyla would fall out of her chair with fear if he moved in closer. After much thought, Leyla placed the fork down. Cheeks flushed, she quickly wiped at her lips with a napkin. So, what do you like? Matthias asked once again. I am not a picky eater. Leyla replied calmly. It was quite a sight for Matthias to behold, seeing Leyla striving so very hard to keep her true self under wraps. Really? Good girl. At his remark, Leyla immediately tamped down her ire, although her eyes sparkled with fury, revealing her true emotions. Let's see just how long you can act like this. Matthias devoured the words he wanted to say with a sip of coffee. Just the slightest glance of Leyla glaring with impudence despite shuddering with despair sent him spiraling into madness. Matthias couldn't stand the thought of anyone else seeing that expression of hers. It gave him a strange sense of superiority, thinking that he was the only person who knew of Leyla Lewellin's other persona. Leyla was demure and stoic, obediently answering any questions he asked while finishing her food without causing a fuss, completely unlike the usual self that Matthias knew. The only times her facade broke was the occasional glances of discontent she sent his way, and the blush that appeared once or twice as she bit her cream-smudged lips. The time they spent together was sweet, if limited, but only obtainable by nefarious means, such as pouring ink onto Layla's coat in a mischievous prank. At the realization, Matthias laughed heartily, only for his pleasure to fade as it dawned on him. He could only give Layla something by breaking her first. So, only by hurting you badly will you be mine. How ridiculous. He stared possessively at Layla, eyes gleaming with an odd light as a smile returned to his face. He found it interesting how her docility, instead of dousing his interest in her, only served to drive him crazier instead. Layla. What must I destroy to possess you? Matthias tilted his head, sinking further into rumination. The sky outside the window was getting dark. Layla finally turned her head, meeting his gaze. Her eyes looked as if they were softly woven with fine green threads, large and beautiful like emeralds. Entranced in their beauty, he could do nothing but admire her gorgeous eyes. Cry, even better if you beg. Chapter 56. Phoebe. You have my gratitude, Dr. Edman. The eyes of Norma Katerina von Herhardt were full of appreciation as she watched him pack his medical bag. Oh, don't mention it. I'm glad that you are back to your peak health. Dr. Edman replied warmly, smiling like his usual kind self. Given my old age, it wouldn't be surprising if my health starts deteriorating. Please, don't say that. Dr. Edman left his work earlier to recheck Norma's health. The Duchess had caught a cold and had the potential to become serious considering her youth had passed. It's all thanks to you that this old woman is enjoying these years in good shape. Isn't that right, Elise? She asked her daughter-in-law who had been silently standing next to the doctor the entire time. Of course. Elise von Herhardt agreed, gladly grabbing the chance to praise their family doctor. You've done well, Dr. Edman. Thank you, madam. I must get going now. Dr. Edman replied as he picked up his already packed medical bag, intending to leave the room. Oh yes, how's Kyle doing? The instant he heard Elise inquire about his son, Dr. Edman's eyes twitched, but he quickly regained his calm and replied with a bright smile. Kyle is doing well. He's currently absorbed in his studies. I see. He will be a great doctor in the future since he resembles you a lot. I'm honored that Madam thinks that way. Will he return to Carlsbad during the winter break? Elise tried probing. I don't believe he has decided yet. True, he might prefer to stay and mingle with his new friends since it's his first break and there's also the option of exploring the south. Yes, either way, I'd like to respect Kyle's wishes. Do tell me his decision. If he decides to spend his winter vacation in the capital, then I'll introduce him to an excellent social club, or if he chooses to go on a trip, I'll help him in any way I can. Elise proposed without hesitation, leaving the other two surprised at her unexpected consideration and kindness, especially Dr. Edman. Please send my regards to Mrs. Edman as well. Elise added as she accompanied him towards the bedroom door. Hearing Elise's considerate words, even though her relationship with his wife had soured, a content smile spread across Dr. Edman's face. Following his departure, the maids also stepped out of the room, and the Herhardts duo were left unattended. You're quite attentive to Kyle, Elise. Norma faintly praised her daughter-in-law as she leaned back onto the soft cushion with a tender smile on her face. After contemplating for a while, I have realized that your words were indeed right. Elise expressed further, if Kyle becomes an excellent doctor, he could be useful to our Matthias. Mrs. Edman and I have grown apart, but I'm trying to respect the Edmans as our family doctor. I'm glad you agreed. Norma replied with an eager nod. Kyle Edman was to replace his father's role as the Herhardt family's doctor after he graduated, if everything went as predicted. The gradual conversation between the pair that had begun with Kyle Edman eventually deviated back to Matthias, the living honor of the Herhardt family. Matthias attended a council meeting at the town school recently. Elise informed with delight. His attentiveness towards such matters amazes me. He is on the right path to becoming the head of the household. I am impressed at how fast he has improved, Norma said, praising her grandson wholeheartedly, which pleased Elise von Herhardt to no end. After all, Matthias was her son. Of course. He will become the best Duke Herhardt has ever had. So to speak, it was a coincidence. Riette proposed attending a social gathering since there was no schedule prepared for the day, and Matthias agreed. The social gathering was pleasant, yet tedious. They finally excused themselves and came across Leyla on their way back. Matthias recognized Leyla from a distance instantly when the car entered the mansion. She cycled her bicycle along the Platanus Road in the October cold, wrapped in the white coat he had gifted her. "Isn't that Leyla Lewellin?" Riet noticed her as the distance from the woman on the bike gradually shortened. "The bird lover that lives in the Arvis hunting grounds?" His eyes switched from Leyla to his cousin who was staring unblinkingly at her with his piercing blue eyes. Matthias nodded without removing his gaze from her. He could see how fatigued she was, yet she endured and pedaled her bike as usual. Realizing that a car had been following her, Leyla parked the bike to the side of the road to make way for the bigger vehicle. Matthias was able to get a good glimpse at her as soon as his car passed by. She was also sporting a pair of brand new shoes that he had bought for her. "If I am not mistaken, earlier, you told me that she's a village school teacher. She should be on her way back home from school." Riet grinned as he kept staring at his cousin, whose eyes never left the girl. "Maybe." Matthias drew his glance away from Leyla at the end of his vague reply. His lips still had a faint smile on its corner. Riet couldn't take his eyes off his cousin's face, who seemed like a little boy experiencing love for the first time. "Got something to say?" Matthias mischievously asked as he turned to face Riet, who had been burning holes on him with his gaze. "We will hunt today. I hope you can join us." Riet replied with an excuse. "I've invited some guests and it wouldn't be right if the Arvis owner is absent." After Riet announced his weekend plan to hunt in the Arvis forest, requests for invitations flooded in. Matthias had shown green light to his cousin's request to invite guests to his mansion. "I can't act like the owner of your estate, Matthias," Riet added just as the car stopped at the front door of the mansion. "Leyla would definitely roam the forest during the weekends, wouldn't she? Come and read on our website Wuxia World site." "Thanks." After contemplating for a moment, Matthias gladly agreed. "Fine." As expected, Riet got out of the car, looking delighted at Matthias he was familiar with. "Now you're acting more like Duke Herhardt, my cousin." Laughing, Riet wrapped her arms over Matthias' shoulders, which Matthias let him do, though he disliked such acts of intimacy. The two men walked alongside each other, entering the mansion's foyer, which was lit up at evening hours. Phoebe was a smart pigeon, intelligent enough to know how to scheme to get her freedom back after she got dissatisfied with being confined in a cage in the backyard. It all started with Bill Remmer. He forgot to lock her cage properly after volunteering to feed the bird on behalf of Leyla one weekend morning as she was busy preparing breakfast for them. The gluttonous pigeon hadn't noticed the unlocked door right away as she was more interested in filling her stomach. It was only while Bill and Leyla were busy raking up the leaves that blanketed the entire backyard that the bird noticed something unusual about her cage. "Don't go out into the woods today, Leyla. The Duke is out hunting with his friends." Leyla sighed deeply as she cleaned the ground. "He has been quiet for a while, but it seems his hobby hasn't changed." Her disappointment was audible as she vented her frustration by sweeping. "What kind of marksman would waste his skill?" Bill pointed out as a matter of fact. "I feel like you're siding with the Duke." I'm not taking any sides. I'm just telling the truth." Leyla smirked as Bill hurriedly turned his words around. "It seems that everyone in Arvis likes the Duke," she stated her observation, and her uncle shrugged. "There's no reason to dislike him. On the contrary, he's the noblest gentleman Arvis ever had. That saucy aristocratic lady is lucky to be engaged to a man like Duke Herhardt." "Yes." Leyla raked the backyard with a brighter smile as she relished the back-and-forth conversation with her uncle. She occasionally glanced at the birdcage and would feel at ease seeing Phoebe safe and sound. Everything was fine. The naughty bird, however, finally made its bold escape when Bill left for work and Leyla began to clean the house. The wooden door of the cage creaked by the wind. Following the sound, Phoebe tried her luck by pecking at the swinging door. She quickened her pace and the rickety door of the cage was fully open not long after. Phoebe was puzzled for a second as she stared at the open cage door, Thinking it was a perfect chance to escape the unfair punishment Leyla had given her for delivering the Duke's letter. The fatty pigeon flapped her white wings vigorously and flew towards the forest, the same place where the Duke's hunting party would head for their session. Leyla took a break from mopping as she heard noises outside and peered out the window. A familiar sight unfolded before her, hounds leading the way and aristocrats following on horseback. She jerked into a tense pose in fear. Repetitive flashbacks of gunshots firing with an eerie light resurfaced in her head. Leyla was startled when Matthias turned his head towards the cabin and caught her gaze. Facing an overwhelming sense of dread, she withdrew from the window, her heart pounding hard. Fidgeting frantically, Leyla fastened the window and drew the curtain hurriedly. It's not my first time seeing them. Why am I behaving more cowardly than before? Her heartbeat had barely returned to normal even after the hunting party had left. The first gunshot was heard as Leyla massaged her cold and stiff shoulders, followed by the resounding barks of the hounds. It's him. The insane Duke who casually kills birds. The small, motionless bird drenched in its blood, wounded by the bullet. The scent of blood. All those memories began to relive itself in her mind. Leyla hurriedly took her bag and left the house to bury those dead birds in the forest once the hunting session was over. She went to the backyard to check on Phoebe first, as if it was routine, to make sure the pigeon was still there before leaving. Phoebe. Layla's face turned pale with fear as she stood in front of an empty and open cage. Trembling, she held the bag strap and ran as she heard another gunshot ringing in the forest. Matthias was the first to shoot. His bullet immediately put an end to the roe deer's life as it galloped through the undergrowth. Are you considering hunting on the ground as well? Riette asked with amusement while he applauded Matthias' success. That would be a little disappointing. I really wanted to spectate Duke Herhardt's bird shooting ability, he continued, commenting on Matthias' sudden change. Riette stopped his nonsense and picked up his gun as the hounds drove him to a new prey, a gray fur rabbit. The deeper they moved into the forest, the more intense the hunt grew. However, Matthias did not make a move against any of the birds even though others added them to the catch. As long as it's not a bird, it's fine, right? Matthias didn't understand the reason for such a random thought, but he soon came to a realization. He didn't want to see her cry. He'd rather that it became a dull hunt than to upset her by aiming for a bird. The sound of the horse hooves running over the thick layer of fallen leaves shook the serenity of the forest. The hunting party set out for the rookeries at the Shelter River, Matthias' favorite hunting location. On the way to the river, Matthias inadvertently saw a familiar bird with white feathers seated on a long branch. Its leg tied with a familiar red thread. Phoebe. His unwitting murmur drew the attention of the others. As one, they turned their heads towards the twig to see the white pigeon perching leisurely without a care. Cry, even better if you beg. Chapter 57. Returning the favor. Leyla ran through the thick vegetation of the forest, eyes frantically darting from one branch to the other. The thick leaves allowed only small rays of the sun through, letting her see clearly whether or not her precious bird was safe and sound. She could feel the thundering beat of her heart against her chest, her heavy breathing as she grew more frantic at finding her missing bird. Her baggage clattered along with every stride she took. She was the only one disturbing the natural stillness of the forest. She was practically heaving by now. The wind was chilly, but the temperature was quite humid, an indicator that the autumn season had finally reached its peak and winter would soon begin to set in. Leyla was beginning to feel the chill in her bones, making her body stiff, draining her strength quicker than usual. But she couldn't stop, not when the continuous gunshots echoing in the forest only served to remind her that she was still yet to find Phoebe, her beloved pigeon. With every gunshot she could hear, another blood-soaked image of Phoebe would run through her mind. Each one worse than the last, breaking her sanity bit by bit. What if she'd already been shot? What if I'm already too late? She couldn't help but think, her chest aching at the thought. You would think that with every step she took she'd be more confident to find her bird alive, but it only made it worse. Her steps began to falter as exhaustion was making its way into her joints, and the air running out of her lungs. the faint scent of gunpowder wafting in her nostrils as the smoky scent surrounded her as she inhaled huge bouts of air. Matthias had promised her he wouldn't touch Phoebe, that he would not shoot the bird. And she had foolishly accepted his word as it is. Looking back now, she should have thought of the possibility that perhaps he was only promising it to appease her. Now she can't help but imagine him breaking that promise as he aimed his gun and shot at innocent birds, Phoebe included, just to get her to pay more attention to him. How could I have blindly believed him? She thought incredulously to herself as she kept running. That promise probably meant nothing to him, brushed it off as something so trivial for him to really keep. Leyla scolded herself for placing her trust in him blindly like a fool, despite already knowing he was a vicious person. She could feel the tears threatening to fall by the time she had reached the end of the forest's tree line, ending up by the road near the shelter river. Should she fail to find her precious bird, she would go find the Duke himself and seek answers to Phoebe's fate. It didn't matter to her whether or not he would grant her an audience. She was prepared to do whatever it took to make sure, even if she had to go down on her knees and beg him for mercy. It was shortly after she stopped to take a breath, did the autumn breeze sweep past her softly. The skies were painted radiantly by a pale blue hue, her eyes closed shut as she soaked in the breeze and wished for a miracle. Leyla snapped them open once more, sweeping one last look around her surroundings before she finally found him. He was standing there. Just there, on the other side of the forest trail. He sat atop his steed, all confident and unbothered as he was surrounded by his peers and fellow comrades. The moment Leyla tried to call out to him, she found herself devoid of a voice. She really wanted to call out to him, but all the breath had left her lungs, and her voice stuck in her throat due to the lack of air. It had been too long since she had started running, and now exhaustion was taking over her, replacing her previous adrenaline rush. She took one last deep breath, before pushing her legs past their limit as she resumed her sprint towards the nobles on horseback. It was only when she neared them enough did she spot one of them had poised their gun at an aim towards one of the branches. A split second later, she recognized it was him. Duke Herhardt. Her eyes trailed from the end of the gun to see what he had been aiming at, and felt her breath hitch as her heart stuttered in fright. Phoebe. Her pace picked up as she tried to stop him from pulling the trigger, her legs screaming in protest at the overexertion. She tried to regain her voice to let out a scream, but only managed a strangled gasp out as a resounding gunshot echoed throughout the sleepy forest. Bang! The end of Matthias' gun was smoking, as soon as he let go of the trigger, and Phoebe was no longer perched on top of the branch. Time seemed to stop after that one moment, until Matthias moved and broke the silence. He slowly lowered his long silver rifle, the sunlight glinting as it slid off, its shimmer bouncing off the air, twinkling through the forest. Meanwhile, Riet and the other nobles looked at him in a mix of bewilderment as well as amusement on their faces. "Well, color me surprised, Matthias," Riet exclaimed. "What the hell was up with that shot?" He teased. It wasn't long before the other nobles followed suit in teasing the Duke. "I can't believe that Duke Herhardt actually missed." "Well, I certainly saw something interesting today." "There's always a first for everything, I guess," they all started to remark, the easy laughter and banter flowing between them naturally. Though Matthias did take the shot, it had only grazed the end of the branch on which the pigeon had perched upon. After that missed shot, the bird fluttered away from the hunting nobles as a piece of the wood broke off and landed on the forest floor. Matthias took all the teasing in pride, smirking knowingly to himself as his sharp eyes trailed intensely after the bird. It seemed to him it was flying towards the east wing of the estate. Why is she here?" Riet wondered out loud, having managed to catch sight of a woman who was standing stock still not too far away from the group. Matthias slowly turned, following the trail of his cousin's gaze, before finally spotting her. He grinned minutely to himself when he noticed he held all of her attention now. "Leyla," exclaimed a couple of the servants when they finally took notice of the unexpected guest. Despite the commotion she caused, Leyla stood frozen as she regarded Matthias in a dumbfounded manner, as if he was the only one she could see. "Leyla!" A servant grabbed her arm, which shook her out of her frozen state. "It's dangerous to go out today. Didn't you hear from Mr. Remmer?" I specifically informed him of the Duke's plans for hunting today. Leyla gulped, eyes wandering back to the Duke's, before going back to look at the person talking to her. I'm sorry, he did inform me, but I must have gotten the dates mixed up, she apologized. Truly, I am sorry. Leyla slowly bowed her head, her hand coming up to rest against her chest, still able to feel the thundering beat of her heart as she lowered her gaze to her feet. Shortly after scolding her a little more of her recklessness did the servants return to their posts, leaving her alone. Meanwhile Matthias acted like he was above the small commotion that had just happened. He pulled on his horse's reins, nudging it to move along as he directed it towards the west wing of the estate, which had been opposite of the direction she knew Phoebe had flown off to. Her tears threatened to fall once more, but only made her eyes shine as the water built up within them. The overwhelming astonishment she felt was too much for her to bear. She was no stranger to the Duke's aim. Throughout her years here, she had witnessed with her very own eyes shot after shot he made. His aim, his posture, his concentration, and his skills with shooting, she was so familiar with. She was certain of this one fact. It was not a missed shot. Today, he purposely aimed the branches and scared the bird off, to fly away from their hunting party so that others could not take a turn at her. And now Phoebe was safe, far away from their bullets and silver guns. As Matthias was leaving, he expertly tilted his head back, eyes meeting with her before treading the curved evergreen trail. Though they were quite some distance apart by now, Leyla instinctively knew that the Duke knew she could see him back. As soon as the hunting party disappeared from her line of sight, she hiked up her skirts before turning around to go back the long way she came from. Only then did her final strength leave her, the exhaustion fully settling in as she felt herself relax. She felt so weightless, like a ghost floating adrift aimlessly, even though she knew exactly where she was headed. She couldn't help but recall a similar instance where she also felt this weightlessness. Images flashed through her mind as she recalled fragments of events long past, but she thought nothing more of it. Leyla can't believe she remembered as much as she did from back then. Gripping her bag tightly on her shoulder, she began to slowly trek through the forest this time. There was no need to rush anymore. Her worries were appeased now. By the time she finally reached her cabin, she felt herself get lightheaded, her vision turning blurry. Leyla no longer had the strength to reach her bed for much rest, so with her last strength, she plopped down on the nearby chair by the porch. Matthias kept his promise, a promise he made to her in particular. And that was another fact she was certain of. Tap, tap, tap. The sound echoed inside the quiet room. Sitting in front of her desk by a lantern, Leyla instinctively rose from her seat at the familiar sound and ran immediately towards the front windows. Excitedly she opened it up with a bright smile. "Phoebe," she exclaimed before her smile froze. Leyla immediately muffled down her scream at the sudden sight of the Duke outside with a hand to her mouth, wary of Uncle Bill, who was just outside, chopping up the firewood by their front yard. Had he heard her shriek in alarm, he would have abandoned his task to immediately check up on her. And she didn't want that. In a hurry, Leyla moved to lock her bedroom door before turning back towards her open window. Matthias was still decked in his hunting gear, the dust and grime of his day's activities adorning the expensive clothing, while the faint smell of blood lingered on him. She could see some specks of blood by his sleeves, and the front of his red hunting jacket. "Your pigeon is over there." Matthias raised his head lightly to point towards the other end of the window frame where Phoebe, her precious bird, was calmly resting. "Come and read on our website Wuxia World site." "Thanks." She held in her cry of relief at seeing the bird, focusing back on the Duke who was standing outside her window. His noble steed, who stood patiently behind him, made him look all the more intimidating for her. However, the backdrop of the soft glow of orange sunset and slowly darkening skies also served to make him look more alluring, bringing out the color of his eyes. She can't help but feel slightly mesmerized by his figure. "Have you thought about it?" Matthias interrupted her thoughts unknowingly. "On how you plan to return the favor?" he inquired, gesturing once more towards Phoebe, while his gaze held onto Leyla's, with one pristine brow rising up at her. Leyla gulped nervously. eyes fleeting towards her bird momentarily before looking back at Matthias. I don't think this counts as a favor, she softly began, before slightly gaining more confidence. After all, you were only keeping your word, Leyla pointed out anxiously, but Matthias only smirked at her in a rather smug manner, making her retrace a few steps back. Though I am very grateful, she added, lowering her gaze. Grateful, you say? He smirked, and what could I do with gratitude? Matthias prodded further. Well, Leyla stuttered slightly, I think it means you are an honorable gentleman, who keeps his word. Uh-oh, he lightly scoffed, taunting her in a subtle manner. Are you then retracting your words from before? Matthias asked, tilting her head, smirk still firmly in place. Leyla frowned in confusion. What words? You described me as the furthest thing from a gentleman, if I recall correctly, said Matthias as he leaned on the window frame, after seeing her confusion. Leyla flushed in embarrassment as the memory resurfaced. Forgive me, she immediately spewed out, I had been too imprudent at that time. Leyla bowed her head further, she felt as though she was digging herself further and further deeper into a grave. But no matter what was done, all she needed to do now was damage control. First you say I'm a gentleman, then the next I'm not, and now I'm once again one. Matthias hummed, cocking a brow at her once more, so which is it? Why you're a gentleman, she stuttered. He then pursed his lips in thought, as he regarded her slowly, raking his eyes up and down her person. Then does that make you the queen? Matthias scoffingly asked. Leyla blinked in confusion, brows furrowing as she racked her brain for a reason how the conversation had turned out this way when a memory resurfaced from when she yelled out at him by the stream in frustration. If you're a gentleman, then I'm the queen. She had meant it sarcastically, of course, but now she found her words being used against her. Leyla wanted to deny it vehemently, but she could tell by the knowing smirk on his lips that her face was already too flushed in embarrassment at the memory. Of course all this could have been prevented had she managed to let a few offhanded comments of his slide, but for some reason, Leyla at that time had failed to control her temper in front of him. Sure, when it came to others she could play the perfect, polite girl act, but whenever it came to the Duke, something in her just seemed to do the opposite. It was a struggle to even keep her calm around him. I apologize for that day. And I sincerely thank you for keeping your promise. I mean it. Leyla apologized to him, though the hesitancy in her posture spoke in volumes. Silence reigned between them once more, the sound of Bill Remmer's chopping axe the only one filling the void between them. Matthias continued to regard her calmly, before sighing in feigned resignation. What should I do with you, Leyla? His hand suddenly reaching out and gripping her chin to force her to look up at him. Matthias clicked his tongue as he pulled her closer to him. I don't need your gratitude after saving your bird. Feeling as though she was doused with a cold bucket of water, Leyla tried to shake his grip away from her, but he was much too strong. Matthias was stronger and faster, and not a second later did her vision blur as he too yanked her glasses off. He had kissed her. She tried to shake away from him, but too late did she realize that his other hand had come up behind her head and grabbed a handful of her hair when she felt a sharp pain as he lightly yanked her head back. Leyla gasped out in pain, and that was the opportunity Matthias took to slide his hot tongue inside her mouth. His tongue darted inside, exploring her mouth ravenously, before sensually entwining around hers. Leyla couldn't help but moan at the sensation. In the background, she could still faintly hear Bill Remmer's grunts loudly as he split some more firewood. Leyla's hands shifted, moving from the windowsill and up to Matthias' shoulder, trying to shove him away. But it only served to deepen their kiss instead. This kiss now was quite different from the kiss she remembered having from last summer's final day. The kiss that scarred her deep in her heart. Instead of the fierce devouring kiss he let her taste before, it was now firm, but gentler, demanding but more delicate against her lips. It wasn't long before his grip on her hair loosened up, allowing her to break free of his grasp. As she gasped for air, Layla's nose picked up his body scent, a blend of the blood of prey along with his minty fragrance. She bit her lips defiantly as Matthias still held onto her chin resolutely, not letting her go just yet. "Just a kiss?" he whispered in a sultry voice. "Is your precious bird's life just this much?" Such a seductively coercive tone fell on her ears. Unfortunately, she neither had time or the strength to think past her current panic. All she could feel was the way her body locked up in place as she stared at him in a flushed manner, her mouth agape as she continued to breathe in air. Suddenly, she was yanked forward, her face now a hair's breadth away from his. "Ugh!" Leyla exclaimed. Matthias regarded her face a little bit, eyes flitting around her features. The grip on her chin was tightening up, she feared he would crush it sooner. Leyla let out a quiet gasp as the grip pained her, before his tongue dove back in her mouth. All she could think about then was how she'd much rather be in pain instead. However, Matthias was persistent in his efforts, his tongue resuming their previous ministrations, dancing expertly around her own tongue as he tasted every nook and cranny in her mouth. Their bellicose kiss continued, coupled by the loud grunts of Bill, alongside the splitting firewood. Each time Matthias intertwined his tongue with hers and sucked on it, she gasped for breath, squeezing his shirt, letting out involuntary moans that seemed to have been scraped up from the depth of her throat with every brush of his tongue against hers. With every noise she made, Leyla felt so ashamed of herself. She could feel herself grow dizzier with each passing moment, her body moving in response to whatever he was doing. Even her hands, who were tirelessly pushing him away, can now only hang limply on his shoulders. She could feel the prickling of tears begin to form, willing them not to fall. Finally, Matthias let her go, letting her gasp for air when he felt her cheeks grow wet, and a sob mixed with her moans. Their lips were now moist with each other's saliva, making it glisten in the dark. Leyla felt her knees go weak, but she caught herself before she fell to the floor completely at the thought of how the two of them looked like right now. "Leyla." Uncle Bill's voice shook Leyla from her unforgiving thoughts. "Leyla, could you bring me a glass of refreshing water?" he requested. "Answer, Leyla," she thought to herself. "I must answer quickly," she urged, but her movements were sluggish as she dazedly stared at the way Matthias took out his handkerchief. Leyla watched him slowly bring it up to his lips and wipe off the evidence of what they had done. It was only when he slightly tugged her face forward did she remember he was still gripping her chin. Next he brought the same handkerchief he used, to wipe off the evidence from her lips as well. Calmly Matthias picked up her glasses he had discarded earlier and replaced them back to where they should be until finally releasing his grip on her. "Leyla?" The sound of Bill chopping firewood suddenly stopped when he began to wonder why there was no reply. "Wash it and bring it back," Matthias ordered, taking hold of her hand, making her fingers grasp the used cloth firmly. He rubbed a few small circles on her wrist before swiftly letting her go, and turned around to ride atop his steed. "Leyla, child. Is there something wrong?" Uncle Bill's footsteps shook Leyla out of her daze as she noticed them grow closer. Hurriedly, she shut the windows, and drew the curtains closed. Immediately, she rushed back towards her door and swung it open, just before Uncle Bill's hand, which was raised to knock, was about to hit it. "Sorry, Uncle. I was sleeping for a moment," she lamely excused, making a show of fixing her hair, which Matthias had been gripping not too long ago. I did wonder why you were taking so long," Uncle Bill told her. I'll get started on dinner right away." "No need to rush, lass," he placated her. "Make sure you're properly awake first. You can slow down," he reminded her, smiling at her fondly. Bill gently patted her on the head before turning around back into the front yard, picking up a glass of water on his way out, before leaving her alone. As soon as she heard the front door shut, only then did Leyla allow herself to feel faint, and unceremoniously drop to the floor. Matthias's handkerchief, which was in her weakened grip, fluttered around her as it too fell, and innocently sank in front of her crestfallen form. "Cry, even better if you beg." Chapter 58. Play with me. The principal's lips pursed into a thin line, her face set with a slight frown as she regarded the woman across from her. Leyla, on the other hand, sat calmly, yet resolutely as she waited for her decision. From her eyes alone, the principal could see that Leyla was determined about this. "Are you sure of this, Miss Lewellin?" she asked Leyla anyway, her eyes peeking above her spectacles to look at her. Leyla only nodded in response. Yes. I'd like to do that. She responded immediately, as though the thought hadn't just hit her out of nowhere. She wasn't kidding about her desire to move away. To teach in a different school, a much farther school. Forgive me for prying, but, the principal hummed as she rested her chin above her clasped hands, scrutinizing Leyla some more. Isn't this school the closest one to home? Why would you wish to be transferred away? As far as she knew, Leyla only had to pedal her bike to commute to school every day. She was asking, not because Leyla was a seasoned teacher, but because she was a hard worker. Sure, she was a novice, often lacking experience in handling matters which would cause a few headaches along her way, but she could see the potential the girl had. In short, she had grown quite fond of Leyla. As a matter of fact, this school was also the best choice she could have of growing experience and a career. Should I also point out that the other Karlsbar schools lack an opening to hire you? The principal inquired, sighing briefly. In addition to that, you would have to move away, find a place to stay in, as well as travel quite a few times just to switch schools? Yes, I understand, and I'm prepared to do it. Leyla did think about those things. It was impossible not to. But she knew she needed to do this. The principal hummed and thought before leaning back on her chair. If there is a problem within the school, then I assure you, we can handle this, Leyla, she said softly. Has there been some troubles between your students? Colleagues? No. There has been no trouble. Leyla vehemently denied. The teachers have been good to me, you most especially. And the children are absolute angels, it's just. The words caught in her throat. How was she to explain her reasons for leaving were not even work-related? Just? The principal prodded, a pristine brow raised at her for further inquiry. Leyla schooled her features, smiling politely. I've thought about this not because of my troubles in school, but rather because I feel as though I need more experience outside my comfort zone. Leyla explained, I want to broaden my horizon. Move past my home so that I could better my skills, for me and the children I will teach. She finished. The principal whizzed at her answer, minutely impressed. How eloquently put, she sighed in resignation. If that is what you truly want, then who am I to deny that? She looked down on her work table and began rearranging papers. Fortunately, there are many who also wish to gain experience here in Karlsbar. So finding a replacement for you shouldn't be too difficult. Thank you so much for your consideration. She thanked profusely. Leyla knew that her experience in Karlsbar was good for experience. The school was fairly prestigious, located in a flourishing city not too far away from the capital of the Berg Empire. A prime job opportunity, in fact, that she landed a job in such a place despite her lack of experience. But it was the only excuse she could think of that would suffice the principal of her requesting a transfer of schools, far away from home. Though you will still need to serve the full semester before your transfer can be processed. The principal continued, however, should you change your mind, feel free to come back and retract your transfer. Leyla doubted she would ever retract her request, even if she was given a whole semester to think about it. She was resolute in moving far away from this place. Thanking her once more, Leyla got up and left the headmistress' office, softly shutting the door behind her, and walked back to her classroom before letting out a long sigh of relief. Checking she was alone, Leyla moved towards the window, watching the leaves of the oak tree outside gently sway with the wind before its stems snapped and fluttered towards the ground. Autumn was nearing its end as winter crept in ever slowly. The sun's rays flowed between its almost barren tree branches, filtering in the light seeping through her windows, casting elongated shadows across her face. I have to leave Arvis, she thought to herself, taking in the sight of what would serve to be her last autumn in the school. Leyla did, in fact, think this through carefully. It took her quite a few sleepless nights and busy days before she reached such a decision. As much as it pained her to be leaving and thus wouldn't be able to spend more precious time with her Uncle Bill, she didn't want to repeat the events that happened with Kyle. She had learned her lesson. She could no longer hold on to impractical wants and desires. It would only complicate things more, make it harder for her in the long run, and ruin everything she had been working hard for. So Leyla decided to focus on her original plans. Besides, just because she'd become a teacher in the neighboring city or somewhere further did not mean she couldn't come to visit Uncle Bill from time to time. She reckoned she could even turn it into weekly visits if she would do it during her weekends. And maybe lodging and board would turn out to be expensive in a foreign place and delay further preparations she had when continuing college education. Still, it was a far better alternative to staying any longer here in Carlsbad. She would do anything just to get away from that man in Arvis. It'll be alright, Leyla softly muttered to herself. Everything will be alright soon. You'll see. She repeated. Perhaps after repeating those phrases over and over, she would start believing in them. And so, schooling a smile over her lips, she went back to her desk. She was no stranger to moving, after all. Her entire childhood consisted of her moving around from one place to the next, staying with relatives, one after another. It made her feel miserable as a child, but it certainly imparted quite a few valuable life lessons, which she found handy right now. Yes, she was an adult now, with a loving uncle to support her every endeavor. Everything would definitely turn out fine in the end. Unconsciously, her fingers went up to gently rub her lips in a back-and-forth motion. She took in a deep breath before standing up to put on her coat. She fixed her belongings and packed what she needed into her bag for the next few days before her breathing stuttered at the sight of a simple white cloth. There, stuffed innocently inside one of her bag's inner pockets, was the Duke's handkerchief. Memories of their latest kiss assaulted her mind before she shook them away and breathed in deeply. She couldn't allow him to affect her any further. And so, without further ado, she locked her classroom as she left and went out of the building. She beelined to her bike, hoisting herself over the seat as she did 1,000 times before, and began to pedal through Arvis. She knew where she was going next. Riet von Lindman dutifully drove his car, eyes kept resolutely on the road. His grip on the steering wheel lightened as he made a soft turn, entering the path leading up to Arvis Estate. As soon as he passed the boundary, he caught in his peripheral a woman, taking shade under the tree. He slowed down to a stop, eyes glancing in her direction. He took note of the bicycle propped against the tree as she stood idly waiting for someone. Who is she waiting for? Riet hummed in wonder at sight. This was certainly quite the surprise, and he wanted to know what she was there for. He unbuckled and got out of the car, locking the door behind him. As he neared the woman, he blinked as he recognized her. "Good day, Miss Lewellin," he greeted as soon as he was near enough to be heard. Leyla, who had been busy spacing out, snapped her head up at the unexpected presence of the Marquis. In her anxiousness, she staggered back when he stopped before her. "Marquis Lindman, a good day to you as well," she politely greeted back after a whole minute, though the nervousness in her persisted. Nervously she looked around, noticing they were alone, and unconsciously stepped back away from him, putting more distance between them. She was already nervous being in the estate. She didn't need any noble poking around to see why she was here as well. But of course, she was never that lucky. "What are you doing here?" Riet asked her. Leyla struggled to answer him. What could she say? The more she thought about why she was even here in the first place, the more she felt stiff and frozen on the spot. She couldn't answer him. Riet, on the other hand, watched as she slowly paled, silence reigning between them after his inquiry. It didn't take him long to piece out the puzzle, and he let out an amused chuckle at her terror. Well, let's see, it couldn't be the doctor's son," Riet chuckled, eyes watching her in scrutiny. "He's not in the estate at the moment." He pretended to think about it for a few more moments before gasping in mock dramatics. "Could it be? You're here for Duke Herhardt himself?" Leyla's eyes snapped back to him at his mocking tone. She could feel her cheeks flush, eyebrows furrowing in response, the shame she felt hidden in her eyes by the glasses she wore. Riet drew closer, hands clasped behind his back, lowering his mouth next to her ear. "The man whom Miss Lewellin is waiting for must be Matthias, right?" he whispered before straightening up, putting some distance between them once more. Upon hearing his suspicions once more, Leyla felt her palms turn clammy, cold sweat slid down her temples, her knuckles turning white as the grip on her bag tightened in frustration. She was only here to return the Duke's handkerchief, but how was it that she felt as though she'd been strapped with the time bomb instead? She didn't want to be trapped alone with him at the annex, so instead, she waited here, by the road. Come and read on our website Wuxia World site. Thanks. Oh, what a mistake that was. Cat got your tongue, Riet mused. Why? Did I hit too close to home? Forgive my rudeness, but I must leave now, Marquis. Leyla forced herself to say, discreetly maneuvering her bag behind her as she turned to indeed leave the place. She'd catch the Duke at a different time instead. However, Riet was taller and nimbler than her. He managed to catch up to her quickly, herding her to a stop as he blocked her exit. Ah, won't you wait a little while for my dear cousin? He asked. You haven't seen him yet, and you've surely waited for some time now. It would be quite a waste of time to leave now. I'm sure it wasn't a waste, excuse me. Leyla dodged once more to pass through him, but instead, Riet grabbed her by the shoulder and held her back. Oh, but I insist, he exclaimed. By the way, did you know that the Duke is actually not at home right now? He told her informatively. In fact, he left to escort his fiancée. He emphasized. Does that upset you, oh poor Miss Lewellin? Leyla frantically tried to get away from his grip, which in turn was also beginning to get on his nerves the more she struggled. Couldn't she see beyond her fear he was trying to help? When Riet had initially stopped and approached her, he had only meant to tease her a little. However, when he learned or rather guessed correctly that she had indeed been waiting for Matthias, the teasing turned into pity. The poor thing didn't even realize her precious Duke had gone and left the estate. He sympathized greatly. After all, he too was in his very own tragic love affair. Riet firmly believed she was also suffering the effects of heartbreak at the news, the same way he suffered when he'd witnessed Matthias heading out the mansion to escort his fiancée, Claudine, this morning. The painful sting of longing was still heavy in his heart, so of course, he understood her. But that didn't mean he wasn't against playing with her a little longer for his amusement. Though come to think of it, Matthias is quite the simple man, isn't he? Riet continued to hold her back, his grip on her shoulder tightening before he grabbed hold of her bike instead, effectively stopping her from leaving. Also, your relationship with him, isn't it akin to that of a mistress? What? Leyla hissed, her breath hitching at the accusation. Yes, that's the exact word, Riet insisted, straightening up as he held her bike far from her. You're almost like the Duke's mistress, are you not? He blinked innocently before smirking at the growing rage on her face. What? Too vulgar for your tastes, Miss Lewellin? Leyla was fuming at the blatant insult to her face. She wanted to tear that smug look off his face in response to baseless accusations. Though that didn't help in easing the shame as she remembered the latest kiss the Duke and her shared, never mind the fact she had been reluctant to do so. It is, isn't it? Riet found it amusing to keep pushing more and more of her buttons. If so, then I deeply apologize for using such a word, he continued to mock, tilting his head for added effect, but the smugness was still there. Give me back my bike, Leyla demanded in anger, arms reaching out to yank her possession away from him, but he dodged her quickly, effectively keeping her bike out of reach. Now, I feel a little disappointed that you, the esteemed Miss Lewellin, who like both the doctor's son and Duke Herhardt, couldn't even stand to be around me. Oh, how you wound me. Riet feigned dramatics as he swooned in mock pain. Very well, here's your bike. And he let it go. Leyla immediately moved to gather her bike, but in her haste to get it, she had let go of her bag, allowing the Marquis to snatch it up quickly. She gasped in panic, abandoning her bike instead as she began to run after the Marquis, who was now busying himself with her bag's contents. Perhaps I could find something here for me instead, he teased her once more, twisting and dodging around her to keep it out of reach from Leyla. I don't know about the doctor's son, But I'm sure I can be more interesting than Matthias. Give back my bag. Come to think of it, even Matthias and I look quite alike. He pointed out, pausing as he touched his chin and looked down on her, raising her bag high above him. Don't you think so, Miss Lewellin? Although I can't give you as much affection as Duke Herhardt, I'm sure I can still make you happy. Uncaring of how she would look, Leyla grabbed on his arm as she jumped to retrieve her stolen bag. She could feel the growing frustration threatening to burst inside her as her eyes blurred and lips began to tremble. Let the dull Duke get along with his boring fiancée, and in the meantime, play with me, Miss Lewellin, Riette said in a sing-song voice as he kept the bag out of reach from her. It was undoubtedly quite amusing for him to watch her hop on her tippy toes to reach for her bag, as though it held all the treasures in the world. Ah well, his hand was beginning to feel numb, and so he immediately dropped it back down and let her have it back as well. Give it back. Leyla wasted no time in snatching it away from his fingers, wrapping it close to her bosom protectively. She sniffed and grabbed her abandoned bike, righted it up and hoisted herself over, and pedaled away. In her haste, she failed to notice her striped shoes slip off. Oh, come on now, I was only teasing. Riette called out after her. Oh Miss Lewellin, I promised to be a good boy. But Leyla was no longer listening and was gaining steady distance between them. Riette only sighed in pity before noticing the shoes left behind. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands before groaning in resignation, and began sprinting towards the direction she left before disappearing by the corner. Screech! He didn't get too far before he heard the alarming sound of a collision between something metallic and another object. Riette slowly began to pick up pace as alarm bells rang in his head. As soon as he turned the corner, he stopped in bewilderment when he saw the sight of a downed woman in the middle of the road in front of a familiar black car, who seemed to have skidded to a stop. Riette stood frozen in place, unsure of what to do when someone hurriedly exited the car. The driver, it seemed, was the first to check up on the woman who stayed still on the ground, and soon a couple had emerged from the back. Matthias and Claudine. Oh my God! Leyla, Claudine exclaimed in panic as she saw the woman. Riette could only stand dumbly as he stared at the scene before him, taking in Leyla's crumpled form and her dented bike by the front of the car. Riette's eyes then were drawn towards Matthias, who regarded Leyla's prone form with indifference. In Leyla's arms, she still clutched her bag like a precious artifact. Matthias raked his eyes over her before his gaze turned to the side to meet Riette's gaze, who stood uselessly in front of an overhead lamplight. It was fortunate that the accident looked worse than it actually was. Despite having been hit by the car, Leyla had only sustained minor injuries, and thus, still managed to stand and walk fairly well. Matthias had suggested taking her to the hospital to be sure, but Leyla had stubbornly refused. After confirming she was fine, Matthias deemed it fit to put the incident behind them. Let's get back to the mansion now, he announced, glancing around at the servants with him, who had been attending to Leyla. Though the servants were particularly concerned about Leyla, they did nothing as they watched her until she disappeared from their sight. Yes, that would be a good idea. Claudine readily agreed after bidding Riette goodbye. So that was the end of that. Matthias dutifully escorted her back into the car. Riette, who looked flushed, following shortly behind them as he headed back into his, by the entrance of Platanes Road. Claudine watched outside the car window, eyes staring worriedly as they both passed by Leyla. She couldn't help but recall the way Leyla had absolutely rushed in front of the car. Normally, Claudine was a calm woman, but when Leyla appeared out of nowhere and got hit by the car, she assumed the worst. I thought she got hit pretty hard. I'm glad that she is fine, Claudine sighed in relief. Speaking of Leyla, she recalled the way Riette had been holding onto Leyla's shoes just moments after he rounded the corner where Leyla got hit. She must admit, she almost let her composure slip at that very moment. She had not expected Riette to be that rash and impatient. Claudine's eyes shifted to her peripheral, discreetly scrutinizing her fiancé. She expected something after that near-death scare for Leyla, but she could not read him at all. Even after this, he was still so indifferent. If she didn't know any better, She would have thought he did not care for Leyla at all. Matthias didn't even look livid about the driving hitting her accidentally, nor questioned Riet about why he had been holding onto her shoes. How very typical of Duke Herhardt. By the time they reached the front door of the mansion, and the car came to a stop, Claudine couldn't help but feel sorry for Leyla. Cry, even better if you beg. Chapter 59 Decent Adult. It did not take long before they reached the mansion. Once the car came to a stop, Matthias got out first, before holding his arm out for Claudine, who took it as she exited as well. They were then led towards the reception room, where two ladies in waiting stood to receive them, alongside his cousin, Riet. What if Claudine was mistaken? Riet thought as he observed his cousin. One would think he would at least show some bit of concern towards the incident on Leyla, but Matthias remained calm and composed throughout the whole thing. If Claudine was in fact correct in her assumption about the Duke being enamored with the orphan, surely there would be some sort of reaction from him seeing Leyla get hurt. He knew he would if it was Claudine. His cousin wasn't an idiot as well, and was wise enough to cover up the earlier incident and brush it off as something trivial. Still, it was baffling for Riet to see Matthias so indifferent. What were his true feelings towards the girl? He'd get to the bottom of things, one way or the other. And so they had dinner served early in consideration for Claudine. As quick as it started, so did it end, and she retired early, leaving the two men alone, to head towards Matthias' study. To be honest, she looked quite lonely, waiting for your arrival on her own. Riet started, so I decided to go and give her some bit of cheer when I arrived. I might have teased her some, but I had not expected her to be so afraid and run away. He eyed Matthias carefully, watching for any subtle hints of emotion as he sat across from the Duke in the study. When there was no change with Matthias, Riet cleared his throat, before languidly leaning back on the chair. I'm talking about her, by the way, he clarified, Miss Leyla Lewellin. The name spilling out of Riet's mouth as though he was spitting out sand, albeit in mild distaste. Much of what he said was indeed true. He might have gotten a little physical, but he'd only meant to tease her. Ah. Matthias hummed, indifferent as ever, but sharp eyes regarding the Marquis in scrutiny. He then let out a low, yet amused chuckle, before sighing at him, looking quite amused by his cousin's antics. It wasn't the reaction of someone affected by a loved one's near-death experience. It seemed too real to be fake, Riet thought to himself. I guess even a womanizer by the likes of Riet von Lindman had their limitations, teased Matthias. Imagine that, you, getting rejected by a woman. Such a woman does exist, he declared jovially. Riet couldn't help but chuckle back. What? Such slander. They both laughed at each other before it died down eventually. Matthias' eyes softened a little bit before turning serious. Well, it does serve you right. Matthias told him, smoothly opening the silver box on his desk and took out a cigarette. He flipped his lighter to light the end before offering one to Riet, who in turn took one for himself as well. Both men settled back in their respective chairs, languidly puffing out smoke. Riet continued to regard Matthias carefully, wondering what would happen now. He was mostly convinced by now, after the laugh they shared moments ago, that Matthias could care less about Leyla. I can't help but feel sorry for Leyla after all, Riet thought as they continued to puff smoke, to think he'd treat her this pathetically. Not one of my best moments, I'd admit to that, Riet said, sinking further into the comfy chair. He felt as though he and Claudine had made complete fools out of themselves. That girl over there, doesn't she resemble the canary Duke Herhardt raises in his bedroom? Those were the words Claudine said last summer during one afternoon as she had been looking out the window, still all smiles and hearts filled with light. She had been busy looking at Leyla Lewellin, who had been returning home after a day's work in the garden. Riet could still remember the way Leyla looked at that moment. Her voluminous blonde hair bounced softly with every step, swaying as the wind fluttered through her. The sweat on her brow glistened, making her shine in the afterglow of the setting sun. She did greatly resemble a bird, whose wings were flapping so exquisitely. "Are you possibly wanting to tell me that Matthias started to raise a canary because of her?" he had asked Claudine in disbelief that day. She only looked at him meaningfully, all confident as she gave him a clandestine smile. "Yes," Claudine conveyed wordlessly. She was so certain, Riet couldn't help but believe her. She was always so rational, so logical, so he trusted that she wouldn't make such a decision lightly on a small coincidence. After all, he too had been a little apprehensive with Matthias' sudden change of heart in raising a bird. Coupled with the fact he had overheard that Matthias had planned to create a rift between Leyla and Kylevman, it seemed more and more plausible that Claudine's assumptions were correct. But how can he act like this? The more he pondered about it, Riet felt as if he had lost his way in a maze of increasingly complex questions. How could he act so indifferent towards the woman he has strong feelings for? Sit across him and make jokes about the way his cousin acted so callously towards her, leading to injury? And if Claudine had indeed been right, what did that mean about their relationship with each other? Have they broken up already? But then why does Matthias still care for the canary, safely tucked in his bedroom? Riet von Lindman. Matthias spoke up, blowing a drawn-out puff of smoke, looking at his cousin now with indifferent eyes. Riet, who had been preoccupied with his growing questions, looked up at the sound of his name, schooling his expression immediately. "Why don't you create your scandals in your own estate and not mine?" Though Matthias slightly corked up the corner of his lips into a smile, his eyes told a different story. "Don't you remember? I'm willing to do anything to keep Arvis in order." He blew one last puff of smoke before disposing of his newly used cigarette to light up a new stick. Both cousins locked eyes on one another. Matthias resolutely trailed on Riet, who still could not pick up any hint of his emotions. There was no tell of jealousy, anger or anything else, other than indifference. In fact, Matthias greatly resembled that of a mischievous child. "Your cousin was a gentlemanly demon." Riet's mind flashed back to the officer he met not too long ago. He held quite the appalled expression as he had been describing how the Duke looked like while on the battlefield. Riet involuntarily swallowed his saliva, making his mouth feel dry. His hand slightly shook the longer they kept eye contact. "I'm sure you know that better than anyone else," Matthias finished in a low tone, warning him slightly before breaking eye contact. At that moment, Riet could see his cousin looked a little worse for wear. A slight look of fatigue could be seen in his face. "I don't understand him," Riet thought, before sighing out, his smoke mixing with the growing fog in the room as both men continued to puff out their cigarettes. "Perhaps a little more provocation is in order. Though I do wonder." His thoughts trailed off as he regarded the growing embers at the end of his stick. He brought it to his mouth and took a long breath in, before blowing another drawn-out puff into the office. "I wonder if the answers I will find prove useful to you, Claudine?" And so Riet swallowed back down his nervousness to calm his nerves. Tap. 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 The familiar sound of Phoebe packing her window broke through the silence of the dimly lit room. Normally, Leyla would have opened it up to let her bird in. However, she found herself stuck in her head, staring into nothing but the space in front of her as she curled in on herself, lying on her side on the bed. She blinked occasionally, looking but not really seeing what was in front of her. Should anyone stare at her eyes now, they'd find themselves feeling as though they were looking inside a deep, yet empty well. Leyla couldn't remember how the accident happened or how she returned to the cabin. She had simply wanted to run away from Marquis Lindman, but next thing she knew, she was met with a burst of light coming towards her, and not a second later, felt faint pain that spread throughout her entire body. Come and read on our website Wuxia World site. Thanks. Though it hurt a lot to be hit, it felt nothing compared to when she found out that the car she was hit with belonged to Duke Herhardt, who had been inside during the incident, with his fiancée, Claudine. At that moment the physical pain she felt was nothing compared to the sudden sting inside her heart. All she could think about at that moment was to escape, to be as far away as possible from them. A few more minutes had passed before she was finally back to herself, but opted to remain in bed for a little while longer. The accident earlier left her with no tear on her skin or fracture in her bones. But it did leave behind a few bruises, and pain in her left shoulder and back, which took most of the hit. It felt as though her bones would crack every time she moved. She should probably get some sleep in, and rest early, but the pain made it impossible to even close her eyes. Eventually Leyla managed to convince herself to get up from her fetal position to open the window for Phoebe to get in. Once the bird fluttered by the windowsill, Leyla noticed there was a note attached by her bird's ankle. Her eyes narrowed as she suspected the note might have come from Duke Herhardt. She was certain of that. With a deep sigh, Leyla untied the note, and lightly caressed Phoebe for a moment. Sensing that she had done its job, Phoebe flew back to its cage, having eaten its fill back at the Duke's mansion. Leyla pursed her lips as she stared at the note, pondering if she could leave the note unread. Deciding otherwise, she quickly closed her window shut and sat down by the edge of the bed. She unrolled the note open, grabbing her glasses by the pillow beside her to read its content. "You need to bring the handkerchief, Leyla. If you don't come here, I'll go there instead." Layla's hand shook as she read the note, her fists clenching at the trepidation that came over her. She soon dropped the crumpled letter on the bed, before sliding down in anxiousness. She clutched the end of the bed, hands fisting over the sheets as her body shook, before she let out a quiet sob. Her hands came up shakily to grab her glasses, tossing it carelessly aside before burying her face into her pillow to release a muffled scream. She felt as if she was going mad. If only I could run to a place far away from this man. However, no matter how hard she wished, reality still caught up to her. She was still here, she was still in Arvis, which meant she was still within his reach. Which brought her back to the letter's content. Should she decide not to go to him, he would not hesitate to come to her instead. He wouldn't mind it too, if he was to be caught by Uncle Bill. Should that happen, then Uncle Bill would. Layla's thoughts trailed off as she recalled one of the things her Uncle Bill had told her some time ago. "You'll become a pretty decent adult." Uncle Bill's fond smile and soft voice filtered through her mind, bringing fresh tears into Layla's eyes. No matter what others had said about her, what rumors spread, Uncle Bill had always been there for her. He believed in her when no one else did. He had been, still is, proud of her and her achievements. He made sure she knew that too. "You're almost like the Duke's mistress, are you not?" That one sentence, from Marquis Lindman, immediately crushed the light feeling from Uncle Bill, with a bitterness that was hard to swallow. She struggled for a while, but managed to find footing to raise herself up from the floor. Leyla gingerly reached out for her bag, which had been thrown haphazardly on her desk, and took out the handkerchief that had been weighing her down all day. Resolving to end this quickly, she clutched the handkerchief and immediately turned to leave her room, locking it behind her. As she passed by the living room, Leyla slowed her steps as she listened to Uncle Bill's soft and steady snores. She hated that she had to leave Uncle Bill, but she knew she needed to if she wanted to escape Matthias. She really despised the Duke so much, so she felt as though her heart would burst into flames. It didn't matter if it was Marquis Lindman who had been the indirect cause of her accident, it was the Duke's involvement with her to blame everything going wrong in her life. She walked out of their house, and braved the woods at night, with only the moonlight to light her way. Overhead the clouds rolled by, often dimming the moon's glow, but Leyla could see just fine in the dark. She was familiar with these woods. She walked the same path she always took towards the annex, reaching the clearing that led to the shelter river in no time. Leyla picked up her pace, eager to put this entire thing behind her. She was freezing, as the nightly chill washed over her, but her cheeks burned with her frustration, giving her heat in the cold. "You came." Leyla stopped when she heard the voice from the darkness. It was Matthias. He was leaning against the railing by the stairway that led outdoors, connected towards the dock and the annex's second floor. His gaze was resolutely locked onto her form, regarding her with a resigned air. "I was just about to leave," he hummed, before he pushed himself off the railing, and began to saunter towards her with a predatory grin as she stood frozen in place. Once he was only a step away from her, He stopped in his tracks and took in the sight of her. Leyla's blonde locks were tousled by the wind, her hair and skirt swaying slightly with the night breeze. He also took note of the goosebumps up and down her arms, and the slight shiver she involuntarily made. "Aren't you cold?" He frowned in concern as he noted she wasn't dressed warmly. Leyla scoffed at the sudden concern he was showing her. Where was it when she had been hit by his car earlier? But that didn't matter to her, not anymore. She thrust her hand out in front of Matthias, her hand holding the clean handkerchief towards him to take. "Here, I'm returning your handkerchief to you." She huffed out, cold puffs of smoke escaping her. But Matthias got cut off, as she hastily made him take the handkerchief back, before pulling away from him. "Goodbye then, Duke," she bid him adieu. "I hope to never see you again, ever," she finished, turning swiftly on her heels. Her task was done, and she felt some weight lift off her shoulders the more she put some distance between them. Only her soft footfalls echoed through the forest. Leyla breathed in the earthy scent of the trees around her, making her head feel clear and refreshed despite her dark surroundings, despite the way her body shook with every step due to her bruised body. "I order you to stop, Leyla," Matthias commanded, a few steps behind her, making Leyla jolt in surprise. She attempted to break out into a run, but found her body frozen after hearing his command. He caught up to her in no time. "Leyla," he called out to her softly, his hands grazing the back of her hand, trailing it up to her left shoulder, before she regained her movement and slapped his hand away from her. "Leyla," Matthias exclaimed in frustration. Immediately he crowded into her personal space, face set into a frown as he grabbed her, and lifted her bridal style as though she weighed nothing more than a feather. Leyla choked on her scream at the sudden change in orientation, before realizing what was happening to her. "No. Let me go. Let go," she yelped, struggling against his hold, but Matthias resolutely held on to her, before shifting his hold on her and hauled her over his shoulder like she was a sack of potatoes. Leyla kept thumping her fists against his back, kicking and screaming against him, but he made no indication he had been affected by anything she'd done so far. Matthias resolutely climbed up the flight of stairs into the annex building, all poised and steady despite his struggling companion. Leyla's screams grew louder with each step, but they were deep enough into the forest and no one else would hear them at this time of night. Matthias kept walking down the corridor, leading them both towards the reception room. He then reached his bedroom, opening the door without delay, before dragging Leyla inside. "Cry, even better if you beg." Chapter 60. I won't make it hurt. Leyla continued to thrash in Matthias' hold, squirming whichever way she could. Suddenly she felt her whole body shift once more, before she was unceremoniously dumped off of him. It was only when her back hit the familiar feeling of a soft bed did she realize where he had taken her and what he planned to do with her. She looked around frantically before scrambling to get up the bed. No. Go away. No." Leyla screamed hysterically, the pain in her body momentarily forgotten. The white sheets which had been painstakingly prepared just this morning began to wrinkle beneath her weight, her thrashing crumpling the sheets in no time. "Stay still," Matthias ordered sternly, immediately catching one of Leyla's flailing wrists and pulled her still. The pain she had forgotten returned in full force, bringing tears into her eyes as she yelped in pain. Matthias frowned, and immediately released his hold on her. Just as he did, Leyla twisted her body further away from him that she had almost fallen off the bed. Fortunately, Matthias' reflexes were quick, and managed to stop her from toppling over, this time his hold gentler from moments ago. However, his resumed contact with her only served to make Leyla thrash some more in panic. "Let go. Let go of me," she shrieked, but Matthias held on to her resolutely, careful not to put too much pressure on her this time. Leyla continued to thrash, making him take a deep breath. "If I let go of you now while you move so recklessly, then you'll only injure yourself further," he tried explaining, but Leyla wasn't listening, continuing to thrash around in order to escape from him. "No. No. No." She kept pushing him away. The more she protested, the more it grated on Matthias' nerves. He won't say it out loud, but he would admit to himself that he misplaced his anger a while ago on Leyla when he had scolded and grabbed her harshly. The anger was for his cousin, Riet von Lindman, after all. And he had dumped it on her in a fit of anger. However now, he could only feel concern over her battered body. Matthias knew very well that Leyla would have hidden from her Uncle Bill the fact she had been involved in a car accident, much less had been the victim of one, so he had prepared beforehand some medicine, safely tucked away in his room at the annex. He brought it here, all the way from his mansion. He had planned to bring her here from the start, reeling her in with a sparsely written note he had attached to the leg of her precious bird. Matthias can't help but laugh mirthlessly to himself as he remembered how imprudent he had been acting, watching as she dragged herself to the edge of the bed. Just as Leyla was about to bolt off the bed and out of the room, Matthias intercepted her and gently plopped her back onto the bed, making her huff out in surprise. She finally looked up at him and began to beg. "Duke, don't be like this, please," she pleaded, hastily moving back from him as she attempted to escape once again, but Matthias swiftly got on top of her, straddling her waist, keeping her in place. He grabbed both of her wrists gently, pinning them over her head as he held her down. Leyla struggled feebly beneath him, squirming futilely before sobs racked her body as a terrible wave of helplessness washed over her. Stop, please," she begged, fat tears streaming down her face. "Please, I'm begging you, stop. It hurts so much," she whispered. She'd been paralyzed by both her fear and the Duke looming above her. The pain in her body screamed for relief the more she strained as she lay on the bed. "Duke, please," Leyla called out pleadingly, whispering beneath him, "it hurts so much." She sniffed, crying softly from under him. The Duke's face began to blur as fresh tears kept forming, but she resolutely met his gaze, as he eyed her carefully. "Did he touch you?" Matthias inquired. "Did Riet touch you in any way?" he whispered as he eyed her slowly from the face to the bottom of her belly. Matthias tilted his head as his eyes met hers once more, prodding gently for her to answer truthfully. His hair swayed to the side as he did, revealing his intense gaze on her. Immediately Leyla shook her head in denial despite the sobs racking through her. She hated what Marquis Lindman had done to her, but hated all the more that Matthias had found out about it. He shouldn't have to. "And no," she began to explain, "he only teased me rather badly that I got so scared that I couldn't help but just up and left in such a hurry." Matthias listened intently as she stammered through her explanation. The shaking of her body seemed to finally calm down after a few more rounds of her crying, then stopping, then crying again, until she calmed herself into exhaustion. Her cheeks glistened with the streaks left by her tears. Gently, Matthias pried off his fingers that held down her arms before moving to caress her hands. Gone was the strong grip from before, replaced only with such gentle and tender caresses. "Stay still, Leyla," he murmured softly, interlocking their fingers together as Leyla stiffened beneath his touch on instinct. "Lie still," he repeated as he held her gaze. "I promise it won't hurt, not even a little." And he dipped his head down a little closer to her. Leyla forced herself to watch as Matthias loomed over her, eyes darting to her prone figure on the bed, then to the room they were in. The two of them were the only ones in the annex, which was located deeply inside the forest. In her head she had already imagined the multiple scenarios she could have done to push him away and make her escape, but she knew there was no escape now. And that just pushed her deeper into despair. "You promise?" Leyla finally responded in a meek voice. She was being quite foolish right now, but she was also earnest. She had no choice but to submit right now. She was at his mercy after all. She hoped that he would also grant her a small mercy in her vulnerable state. Leyla looked up at Matthias pleadingly as he remained unresponsive to her inquiry. She shivered as he stared at her some more. His eyes raked her up and down in appreciation, wetting his lips lightly at the sight of her tear-streaked face. Finally, Matthias nodded at her in promise, making her sigh deeply in relief as she relaxed underneath him. He pulled himself away from her, hands digging into the pocket of his jacket where he had shoved the returned handkerchief carelessly in his haste to catch up to Leyla. Leyla allowed herself to remain still despite being unbounded by the Duke's hands, watching his hands, and believing in the promise he'd take care of her. She watched as he brought the handkerchief next to her forehead, and began slowly dabbing away the sweat on her brow. Matthias kept gently wiping at her face, grabbing her chin gently to keep her eyes on his when she instinctively tried to turn her head away from him. Her emerald orbs shone brightly in the dimmed light. He tucked back her ear a few stray locks of her hair before fully standing up as he finished wiping her face clean. Leyla watched attentively every move he made, struggling to stay still so as to not aggravate him. Matthias then got off the bed as he rummaged through some of the things he had set aside, and returned with the medicine box in hand. He then sat down by the edge of the bed, and laid it on the bedside table, before turning to her calmly. "Show me your injuries," he gently ordered, and Leyla immediately shook her head frantically, and began retracting her words from before. "Oh, there's no need really. I wasn't really injured even." "You said it hurts." Matthias interrupted. "Your words were, 'It hurts so much,'" he reminded, eyes narrowed as he regarded her. "No, that was." Leyla stumbled through an explanation, unable to provide a good excuse on the spot as she gingerly sat up from her position. Her eyes darted everywhere around her but his. Slightly annoyed by her stubbornness and refusal to look at him, Matthias began to uncuff the sleeves of her blouse, immediately gaining her attention. She panicked and began to struggle once more as he rolled them up to her elbows. "I guess the arms were uninjured then?" he remarked dryly, swifting grabbing the hem of her skirts, riding them up further as it hiked above her knees. Yelping in the suddenness of his actions, Leyla stilled his hands immediately. "Back," she blurted out. It's my back. That hurts." She trailed off in all honesty. Matthias stopped moving his hands as he stared at her, urging her to continue. "I hurt my back a little, and my left shoulder," she reluctantly admitted. He pursed his lips together, backing away from her to give her one more once-over, to determine if she was telling the truth. His fingertips tapped on the lid of the medicine box rhythmically, making Leyla squirm in the silence between them, before the tapping stopped. "I want to see it then," he demanded. "Take it off." "Come and read on our website, Wuxia World site." "Thanks." Layla's eyes snapped towards him, before shaking her head in denial once more, unwilling to remove any layers of clothing around him. But Matthias wouldn't take no for an answer. His eyes narrowed at her before growling under his breath. "If you won't let me take a look, then I won't hesitate to call the doctor for you," he hissed and stood up, grabbing the medicine box with him. "And not just any doctor, mind you, but Dr. Edman," he threatened her. Layla's breath hitched at the thought, before shaking her head once more, pleading for him not to do it. She would rather drown by the shelter river than be caught dead by Kyle's father in such a compromising position. She looked practically scandalous as she lay on the Duke's bed. "Then make the choice, Leyla." He gave her an ultimatum: "Either strip and allow me to assess your injuries myself, or I will call for Dr. Edman." Matthias had left her alone with her thoughts, basking in the room's silence for quite some time now. Layla's body was still aching due to the strain it underwent with her thrashing and squirming. Matthias waited patiently for her final decision. He reclined against the nearby chair as he continued to run his eyes up and down her figure. He sighed deeply, watching her rumpled form on his bed, hair a mess and eyes swollen red. There was something sensual in the way she basked in the dim lighting, all shrouded in doubt, fear, sprinkled with a dash of hope and trust in him. Do you really promise?" Leyla finally asked, breaking the silence. Her eyes clenched shut as she resigned herself to her fate. It didn't matter anyway if she would try to negotiate with him. His promises, her promises, they were only just words unless they made it true. She was well aware by now that Matthias could do whatever it takes, just so he could get what he wanted in the end. Just as he once did before. The circumstances between them hadn't changed. She was still bound to cross paths with him, doomed to suffer in his presence. She would only complicate things further for herself if she would continue to resist. She had her answer now. She's made a decision. But that didn't stop the fresh tears from running down her face as she felt utterly useless in front of him. The tears flowed, saturating her blouse the more she cried while Matthias continued to stare at her. How happy he must be again to see me cry. Leyla thought miserably. She choked down her sobs, swallowing as she turned away from him, giving him a silent permission to undress her himself. She felt the rustle of his clothes, and the dipping of the bed. Calloused hands came up to her shoulder, caressing her back gently as it trailed towards the buttons at the back of her blouse. Slowly, she felt the gradual loosening of her blouse as his fingers deftly unbuttoned it one by one. Her body shook with sobs as she kept her head down, aiding in removing her blouse once everything had been unbuttoned. She wanted to keep even just a little bit of her pride by refusing to look at the Duke. The cloth slid down her skin, revealing the soft, smooth flesh underneath. It had only been a second, but for Matthias it felt as though time moved slowly, sensually revealing inch by inch her skin, teasing him, goading him to touch it. From the slender slope of her neck, to her petite shoulders. His eyes traveled further down, following the perfect curve of her back, riddled with blotches of red bruises. It looked as though any touch of his would bring her to her knees in front of him. Matthias found himself mesmerized by the swelling on her back. It was littered everywhere on the expanse of her left shoulder blade, down to her waist. It was no wonder why she wailed like she did in pain. He found himself amazed by her strength in brushing her injuries as if they were nothing as she continued to bike away from him. Though she did look a little pathetic as she did so as well, running away like a dog with her tail between her legs. If I had ignored it, you would have hid your bruises and suffered all by yourself. Matthias thought, causing an anger-like feeling to well up inside him. Opting to push it down, he began to move, lightly touching the bruises. Only Leyla yelped in pain, making her flinch away from him, twisting her body as if to shield her prone side despite her state of undress. He hummed in thought, a frown marring his face. It would prove difficult to treat her if a slight touch would cause her too much pain. Tell me if the pain gets worse, Matthias murmured softly as he moved his hands, touching the areas around the bruises instead as he assessed the extent of her injuries. Whenever she tensed up beneath his fingertips, or let out soft groans, he would ease up, and move to the next area after she had relaxed once more. It was fortunate that Leyla could still move her arms and shoulders. The ribs and spine seemed to be fine as well. Overall, she was in good condition considering a car had hit her. The creases on his forehead disappeared as he found himself relieved and quickly proceeded with the treatment. He took some smoothing salve, before wrapping her bruised shoulder with bandages in silence. Leyla sat still, head still looking down, as her body shook in the tension between them. Matthias rubbed smoothing circles on her uninjured side as he went and wrapped her bruises securely, yet tenderly. He had been right, she was smooth to the touch, very soft beneath his fingers. He wanted to touch her more. She was such a frail woman indeed, so small and so vulnerable. Leyla, Matthias softly whispered. Leyla found herself raising her head in response, a little dismayed at how quickly she did so. By the mantel on the fireplace, hung a large mirror, with an intricate golden frame. In it, was her reflection. She met her gaze in it, seeing as clear as day, the shame and despair written in her eyes. Her eyes then shifted to meet Matthias in the mirror, seeing his cerulean eyes staring back at her. A strange feeling came over her, locking her in place as she found herself unable to look away despite the terror she was feeling. Why? She wondered to herself the more she looked at him through the mirror, trying to convey the question with her eyes. So innocent. So clearly looking at him for some sort of explanation as to why this was all happening. Matthias chuckled dryly to himself in his mind, his eyes breaking contact to take on her now bandaged shoulder. He felt too hot, his breath controlled, yet too harsh as he struggled to wet his parched lips. His eyes went back to look at Leyla once more, before realizing that he had been the one to back away first from her. In all his years of knowing Leyla, He'd never once backed down for her. Damn it. He cursed himself for his ineptitude. He felt as though he had been cursed, but only he could feel the way his body grew hotter, breathing out hot puffs of air through his mouth. Before he could let out another sigh, Matthias leaned forward and planted a light kiss on Leyla's shoulder in order to turn a blind eye to the unfamiliar emotion stirring inside him and a vague attempt to console the wounded girl. He wasn't acting like himself, but he found that didn't mind, not even a little bit. "It's all right," Matthias tenderly whispered in Leyla's ear while she attempted to turn her body away. His voice dipped down into a husky tone, creating a strange sensation traveling down Leyla's spine. She hastily avoided his gaze once more, unable to look any longer in the mirror. The last sight she saw was seared into her mind. His strong imposing figure loomed behind her vulnerable form, his large calloused hands wrapped around her bare waist. She tried to subtly shrug the hand off of her, but was unsuccessful to do so. Matthias continued to trail soft kisses through the expanse of her shoulders, before one hand traveled to grab and interlock their fingers together. As the pain in Leyla's body began to soothe, she found it being replaced with a foreign sensation pooling in the pit of her stomach. Leyla clenched her eyes shut, feeling more vividly the way the Duke's warm breath grazed her skin. The touch of his lips, and the impression it left as he continued his tender ministrations across her bruises, were as soft as a feather.